The baby was small, almost incredibly so, with rosy cheeks, pouty lips, and the biggest, most adorable brown eyes Kisuke had ever seen. The tiny fluff of orange hair on the baby's head was interesting, likely a herald to the Kurosaki's earlier matriarch Megumi, who had sported the same bright, shocking, near unbelievable hair in the portrait Kisuke had found when he had been snooping. It was the same hair she had passed on to Mosaki, though the young Quincy had only inherited a softer shade. Ichigo, you said his name was? Kisuke asked, turning from where his eyes had been glued to the baby to glance at Mosaki, who was tucked into Isshin's arms with a sort of weariness to her features. Isshin was beaming as if the world itself lay at his feet. The scientist silently prayed for the baby who would have to deal with Isshin's overbearing Shiba antics. Mosaki nodded with a half-smile, her eyes falling to the crib and the small life form tucked inside. One that had the potential to defeat Aizen when they wouldn't be able to. The queen of the philosophical chessboard. Mosaki with her sharp eyes, but ditzy smile knew that as she nodded, running one hand through her hair and commenting, "Yes, Isshin says the name has been in his family for decades, regardless of its ulterior meanings." "But I think it suits him, don't you, Urahara-san?" The mother finished with a flick of her hair and a snap of her eyes. Kisuke hid the shiver of fear that traced his spine at the way the young woman had pronounced his name with all the frayed danger of Uno Hanataisho. The scientist silently and dutifully acknowledged that mothers were not a force to be tampered with and nodded his head in a subdued manner. The Quincy woman studied him for a moment with all the ice of the Siberian fortress in her veins before she nodded and returned her attention to Isshin, who had missed the whole interaction and was as usual completely oblivious. The two parents spoke to each other in quiet whispers about the adjustments they would need to make to their small home. Mosaki briefly mentioned her cousin returning to Karakura town with his wife after a trip outside the country, and they had a child. Maybe we should visit them? Kisuke returned his attention to the small life form in the crib and acknowledged the near-invisible presence of Yoruichi as she entered the room quiet as a cat. Large brown eyes stared up at Kisuke with a love so unfounded and undeserved that the blonde-haired scientist almost found himself speechless in his thoughts. It was like glancing into the void and having the void welcome you regardless of past sins or mistakes. Yoruichi slipped beside Kisuke and peered into the crib, staring at the baby for a moment with an unreadable expression. One that was like carved stone and bore resemblance to the Shihin statues resting throughout the large mansion Kisuke had raced through in his youth. There was something in Yoruichi's appealing features that reminded him of the Onmitsu kid and how in the face of duty, morals weren't an option. He wondered, or rather knew, that the former captain of the second was considering that as she stared into Ichigo's big brown eyes, and the baby happily gurgled at her. For a split second, at the wide toothless grin, a small smile slipped across Yoruichi's features, faint and hardly noticeable if one didn't know the woman incredibly well. But Kisuke did know Yoruichi incredibly well. After all, it had always been them and Tessai, and the smile left the scientist wondering if Yoruichi wanted children. The thought seemed somewhat absurd and abstract. The idea that Yoruichi, vicious, ruthless, and youthful Yoruichi wanted children spiraled around in Kisuke's head for a while. Eventually, the scientist placed it in the booth things to contemplate and returned his attention to the former leader of the Onmitsu kid. The cold look was on her features again, bright and sharp, but something doubtful there and fragile that had appeared the day Aizen had shattered their world and left frayed knots. Yoruichi watched as the baby rolled on the cot and teethed on one of the many toys Isshin had loaded in there, probably too many, but Mosaki would handle it, and asked in a whisper as quiet as the breeze, "Are you sure about this, Kisuke?" "He's an innocent." Kisuke frowned at the statement. He knew it was true, he knew it in the deep marrow of his bones as he stared into those brown eyes and silently repeated a mantra about not getting attached. But they needed Ichigo and all the things he represented. The small orange-haired babe in the crib represented their only hope for a future where the Hollows, Shinigami, and the Quincy could hope to work together. Ichigo was the only hope in defeating Aizen, who already had a Hogyoku of his own and had numerous threads tangled every which way like a spider's web, some even Kisuke couldn't see. The child would be powerful, incredibly so, and their only hope. Was it right to place that burden on the shoulders of a mortal soul? It couldn't be, and Kisuke knew the excuse for the greater good was as empty and full of holes as the place Soul Society once held in his heart were. But it was the world or the innocence of a child, right? "We have to." There's no other way," Kisuke admitted in a tone that belied the confliction the scientist so rarely felt. At heart, the blonde followed the call of his MSTRS science, his mind tugging and following whatever path of inquisition it sought, and rarely did it question morality. But putting the weight of the world on the shoulders of a child, even to discover how a hybrid of his nature would evolve and adapt and all the potential theoretical outcomes? It felt wrong. Yoruichi frowned but said nothing, staring at the baby with those golden eyes, ones that reminded Kisuke of a predator hiding in the shadows, waiting, watching. Then the small life form, so incredibly small, gurgled happily at Yoruichi with a toothless smile and a crinkle of brown eyes, and the hardened soldier of the Gotei 13 cracked and made cooing faces at the small child who burbled happily with laughter. Kisuke muffled his own smile into the sleeve of the long yukata he wore, one that hid the scars from the civilians and left him feeling comfortable in his own skin. Letting his fingers dangle in the crib, the blonde scientist watched as the baby moved without a care, wide curious eyes absorbing the world around him. Suddenly, a tiny hand was wrapped around Kisuke's pinky, little fingers tugging tightly on the joint and grabbing the man's attention. Grey eyes connected with deep brown, and instinctively Kisuke knew that his plans would not survive this child. The daycare was a sunny sort of place, the walls were cream white and the art of children, whimsical and misshapen, decorated the walls. Ichigo huddled behind Mosoki's legs, stared happily up at his mother. He didn't listen to the other children as they ran about screaming happily or battling over the toys or playing house. It was time for Ichigo to go home, and at that moment the daycare and the nice Miss Homura didn't matter. Or at least Miss Homura wouldn't matter if she would stop talking to his mother about how Ichigo needed to play more with the other children, how he was a nice kid, loved reading, how he played doctor with the other children, and he was such a great big brother already. Mosoki laughed and rubbed her hand over her swollen stomach, and Ichigo stared for a moment, wondering about his future baby sister or baby brother. What would they look like? Would they have orange hair? Would they like reading? Ichigo knew, however, that no matter what he would be a great big brother. His mother had told him so, and she was always right. Ichigo also knew that in order to be a great big brother he needed to protect his siblings and be really smart. But first Ichigo wanted to go home, so he tugged on his mother's skirt. Mosoki turned her head slightly, whispered a gentle, "in a minute," and resumed speaking to the daycare teacher. Ichigo frowned for a moment in consternation at being ignored before a flicker of something dark and very red out of the corner of his eye distracted the young toddler. Ichigo turned and squinted at the doorway, studying it for a moment, waiting for whatever he saw to appear once more. Then it was there, a flicker of red fabric darting out of the doorway. Determined to discover what the mysterious fabric was, Ichigo glanced up once at his mother, who was still conversing with the nice Miss Homura, and toddled towards the doorway. Ichigo, for all his bright orange hair and adorable smile, was not particularly noticeable when he wanted to be. And if at that particular moment one of the children threw a tantrum, well, that was just fate. Ichigo slipped out of the wedged open doorway and with a determined look walked down the empty street. It was early in the afternoon and the daycare was in a quiet neighborhood. There wasn't much around, a convenience store, an old run-down candy store, and the road received little traffic. As Ichigo walked down the street, a bright red car passed by with a whoosh of mechanics catching the toddler's eyes for a moment before the faint red fabric appeared once more. It reminded Ichigo of the flashes of black and white he sometimes saw hanging over his head at night. It was the sound of humming in the air, not unlike the sound of a particularly hot summer's day, that caught Ichigo's attention and dragged his gaze from the sidewalk to the right. In the buzzing heat of the early afternoon stood a building. It was old and dilapidated looking, made of a plain wood with windows that were impossible to see through and a yard full of dust. There was also a conveniently located sign within Ichigo's vision displaying the image of a faded lollipop. Ichigo, who had been taught the same lesson every child was about taking candy from strangers, stared suspiciously at the sign for a moment. However, a light clatter from the shoji doors caught the toddler's eyes, and he watched as the intriguing piece of red cloth he had been following for what felt like ages disappeared inside. For a second, the young child stared in indecision before, with a nod, Ichigo climbed up the 2 wooden steps and with a great push slid the rice paper doors open. The shop smelled like incense, dust, and quite obviously sugar. Rows of bins with faded colorful logos lined the walls and led to a desk at the end of the small and narrow room. Wide brown eyes gazed around the room at the slow-moving ceiling fan that whirled the hot air around and at the floor lined with whirls of wood, and finally at the candy itself. For a moment, Ichigo felt very scared and sad. He didn't know where he was, or where his mom was, or if she would be angry with him. They had already talked about following spirits numerous times. A rattle of doors clacking together drew the toddler's attention, and Ichigo glanced up to meet the sight of a man with a bright green hat with stripes and straw blonde hair swaying out of the doorway, which was billowing an ominous purple sort of smoke. The scientist paused while he adjusted his hat, as if just noticing the presence of something else in his humble shop, and glanced down the long aisles filled with candies, many of which he had imported on request of the various neighborhood children, and Shinji, who was much the same. The blonde Shinigami dropped the fan he had been anxiously fluttering about as he contemplated his latest disaster of an experiment, wide eyes studying the small orange-haired Anfan staring up at him. Part of Kisuke wanted to laugh, but the rest of him was very concerned as to the sudden appearance of a young Ichigo Kurosaki in the middle of his candy shop. Deciding to sate his own curiosity and hopefully the ire of Mosoki when she found him, Kisuke plastered a gentle smile on his features and stepped out from behind the counter and crouched down to Ichigo's level. "So, brave wanderer, how did you find my humble shop of various candies from across the known world?" Kisuke asked in a tone of bravado, enjoying the way Ichigo scrunched his brow and squinted at Kisuke in a suspicious manner. Those wide innocent brown eyes flickered past Kisuke for a moment, landing on something invisible in the distance before returning to Kisuke with something less suspicious and more open. The toddler squished his lips together for a moment in what was undeniably an adorable expression before responding. X. That was how Mosoki found them 15 minutes later, seated on the floor of the Urahara Shiten, a small pile of candy wrappers between the two and her son babbling happily about the adventures he wanted to go on when he was older. The worried mother leaned against the doorway for a moment, taking the second to calm herself and put away the guilt and worry that had surged up and choked the words from her mouth in icy cold claws. She watched for a moment longer as she regained her breath, noting the way Ichigo gestured with his arms in wide outflung motions, eyes bright and shining, animated in a way the toddler wasn't at the daycare down the road. The former captain of the Gotei 13 sat across from Mosoki's son, staring at the child with bright enchanted eyes as if the man had quite forgotten the boundless energy of life that a small child could contain, talking with the same excitement of her son about healing. The young mother watched and wondered at the scientist who had aided the young Quincy, an enemy according to Soul Society when she had been in death's grasp, who had continued to support the growing family held in the palm of her hand. She wondered at the looks the scientist had thrown at the child, scrutinizing and full of speculation, and the change she could see now in the man. It was something recognizable in the mirror, that fierce longing to protect the small life form in front of you regardless of all other compactions. Mosoki Kurosaki wondered if Kisuke Urahara still desired to use Ichigo to further the plans of Soul Society, or if the man's interests had changed. Sparing a glance at the watch wrapped around her wrist, Mosoki realized Isshin would call if they didn't return soon, the silly man full of far-flung concern and outrageous theories. Coughing lightly, she gathered Urahara's attention and watched as Athena Grey eyes swung towards Mosoki and the man's face paled in fear. A part of her was vindictively pleased with the expression. "Good afternoon, Kurosaki-san." Kisuke greeted pleasantly, gathering Ichigo's attention at the words. The orange-haired toddler glanced up with a blinding grin, ran forward and hugged his mother, looking up at her with a grin and squinted eyes, Rietsu swirling almost visibly around the child. Kisuke stared and said nothing even as his thoughts raced at the potency of the child's Rietsu. The Kurosaki matriarch laughed for a moment at her son's actions, ruffling a hand through brilliant orange locks before she beckoned the toddler forward. "Hello, Urahara-san." The woman greeted with an edge of steel to her voice in a sudden swch from the smiling mother, warning that the man should have a sufficient explanation for everything. Ichigo, unaware of the tension spiraling between the adults, turned his attention to the flash of dark red he could see hovering out of the corner of his eyes, and called after it. In the same moment, the back door to the Urahara Shiten slid open and Tessai stepped out with a searching glance. The former Kido Corps leader paused as he observed the Kurosaki matriarch, her son, and his friend standing with his figurative hackles raised. Kisuke turned with an expression of relief at the large man's sudden appearance and asked, "Tessai, if it's not any trouble, will you prepare some tea please?" Tessai studied the room for a moment, noting everything that was lingering unsaid as Ichigo tottered around chasing at thin air. The man nodded and disappeared into the back room. Mosoki's brow furrowed at the scientist's words. She didn't really have time for tea with the enigmatic man. But she supposed as she studied the scientist with narrowed eyes, she needed an explanation and Isshin would, hopefully, survive a little while longer without her.
"Why don't we head inside, Kurosaki-san?"
Kisuke suggested with a placating smile and a tip of his hat. The Quincy considered the man for a moment before her eyes flickered to her son. Ichigo was chasing after something invisible, babbling about the color red. The mother turned her attention to the scientist and raised a brow in partial confusion at the sight. For the most part, Mosoki Kurosaki could see the vague outlines of the many spirits that haunted Karakura. But there was nothing in front of her son. The former captain of the 12th turned his attention to Ichigo with an inscrutable expression, one that was wrapped up in layers of secrecy and thought. After a second, the man's eyes flickered to Mosoki and he stated softly, "There is no plus spirit there, Kurosaki-san."
"Is it likely an imaginary friend?"
Mosoki considered the question even as the Raiman beckoned the woman inside his home. Picking Ichigo up in her arms to the happy giggle of the child, Mosoki responded, "Perhaps, but imaginary friends more commonly appear around at least 5 years old from what I've read." Kisuke chanced an intrigued glance at the mother at the mention of reading material charting childhood development. With a hum, he slid a door open and revealed a sitting room warmed by a light shade of yellow and pale brown. Mosoki frowned as she settled on one of the seats set around a low table and set Ichigo on the ground. The child would prefer to explore. "It is possible, but at the moment I can't ascertain anything. When Ichigo is older, if he speaks to them and describes them, we may be able to make inferences," the man suggested as he settled in his favorite chair that had just enough space for Yoruichi to sit beside him in her feline form. The mother across from him nodded, appeased by the vague answer for a moment before cold brown eyes focused on Kisuke. The scientist swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry at the pure protectiveness that rose around the Kurosaki matriarch, eerily reminiscent to Unohana, but twisted with the wrath of a mother. "Urahara-san, why was my son in your store?" Mosoki questioned with a tone of ice. Kisuke fiddled with the sleeve of his hari for a moment, running through words in his head as he tried to find a way to diffuse the situation that didn't involve his head on a pike. The scientist sighed quietly but was saved from answering immediately as the door slid open and Tessai entered, a tray of tea balanced on the man's arm. Tessai nodded once, placed the tray on the table before them, and with a small grin at a staring Ichigo, left the room. Kisuke took a sip of the steaming tea, allowing the familiar taste to calm his nerves and the way his hands wanted to anxiously flutter about even as Mosoki repeated the motion, her eyes never leaving Kisuke. Finally, the scientist glanced into the eyes across from him and honestly expressed, "I didn't lure your child here, Kurosaki-san. I have no idea how he stumbled upon my store when there are a few other buildings of note to a toddler on this street. I can assure you that my intention was not to abduct your child in order to experiment or test his abilities in any way, shape, or form." The mother listened to the words with a calculating stare that reminded Kisuke of a viper, unblinking eyes watching each minute detail of his features. Mosoki Kurosaki was just as terrifying as Yoruichi. Eventually, after a tense moment, where Ichigo obliviously clambered over the furniture, the mother leaned back in her chair and sipped at the tea. "I am not fond of the idea of my son becoming a pawn in some grand game, Urahara-san. Ichigo doesn't deserve that, and you know it." Ichigo chose that moment to come along and tug at Kisuke's hari with infinitely hopeful eyes as the man produced a candy from his voluminous sleeves. Mosoki spared a smile and continued, "Swear to me on your honor that you will protect my child, Urahara-san." The demand shocked Kisuke, leaving the man to stare wide-eyed for a moment before catching himself. It was a demand that felt impossible and all-consuming, dragging holes through everything the world would throw at the young toddler sucking happily on the red candy Kisuke had given him. It was also the only way to earn Mosoki's acceptance, to let the mother know that the scientist who had tempered a god cared for her son. Kisuke stared into the pale amber-colored tea in his cup for a moment, debating the merits of swearing a vow, one on his honor, whatever bastardized version existed. Some part of him, The part of Kisuke that justified his actions with the greater good whispered that a promise could be broken. Kisuke knew this wasn't one of those promises. Glancing up from the mug in his hands, the former captain of the 12th glanced into Mosoki's eyes and responded, "I swear to protect Ichigo in all the ways possible to me so that he may grow and live." The Kurosaki matriarch ran through the words in her mind before she nodded, something heavy on her shoulders easing slightly. Suddenly, Ichigo burst out, "Mom!" The lady in the red dress answered me. The two adults traded concerned glances even as Mosoki responded in excitement and Kisuke contemplated the meaning of the child's words. Mosoki, as she ran a hand through her son's hair, glanced at the time before letting her flicker to the shopkeep across from her. Scooping Ichigo up, Mosoki said teasingly to her son, "It's time to go now, Ichigo. We need to have a talk about wandering off and your father is probably worried. Say goodbye to Kisuke-san." The orange-haired child pouted at the mention of his potential scolding but turned in his mother's arms to wave at Kisuke with a big grinning smile that made Kisuke's heart do a weird little happy tap dance. Mosoki smiled in understanding and stepped closer to the man for a moment and whispered, "Next Tuesday stop by for dinner, Urahara-san. You're Ichigo's godparent and you better start acting like one." The scientist took the warning and invitation for what it was with a nod, Athena gray eyes serious and understanding beneath the brim of his favorite hat. Mosoki smiled faintly and nodded once in parting before sweeping out the door. Kisuke watched the striking figure of the PRGNNT Kurosaki matriarch for a moment, the image of Ichigo smiling up at him flashing through the forefront of his mind as Kisuke wondered how a godfather was supposed to act. The door to the Kurosaki home opened with the glide of well-oiled hinges. Kisuke Urahara stepped inside and slipped off his unassuming hat, letting his shoulders settle slightly from the tight line they had drawn themselves into. If it was known he visited the home of the Kurosaki family on a regular basis, the potential fallout could be disastrous on both sides. The man surveyed the warm home with a fond smile, the scent of dinner lingering on the air, family photos lining the walls, and soft jewel tones instilling a peaceful aura. The former captain of the 12th Division had only a moment of peace before the sound of running and thumping made themselves known, and Ichigo, at the wonderful age of 5, appeared around the corner with a bright grin. The scientist had only a moment to prepare himself before the grinning boy launched himself at Kisuke with a happy cry of, "Uncle Kisuke!" The uncle in question caught Ichigo in his arms and spun the child around to the happy giggles and laughter of the orange-haired kid. Smiling in an unrestrained manner, Kisuke set Ichigo onto the ground with a final spin and turned his attention to the hallway. Mosoki appeared with the twins held in her arms, Yuzu with a bob of hair like spun gold and the gentlest nature Kisuke had seen in a child, and Karen hair as dark as ebony and fire in her veins. Mosoki looked tired, the shadows beneath her eyes brilliant in the warmth of the evening. But the weariness was detracted by the soft smile on the mother's features. Kisuke nodded once in greeting, grey eyes solemn for a moment in assurance even as he rose a brow in question. The mother spared a faint nod before her eyes drifted to her oldest child. Ichigo was in the middle of rising from a bow, his eyes flickering to the left of Kisuke with something like respect called in the kid's brown eyes. With a happy grin, Ichigo turned to Mosoki and stated, "The lady in red says hi." At the statement, Ichigo's head whipped around once more to stare at the empty space behind the shopkeep with something like an apology scrawled there as the child rubbed at the back of his head. Kisuke studied the scene with careful eyes, noting the way Ichigo's Reiatsu seemed to flow like an endless whirlwind around the child, even with the control Mosoki had been trying to teach him. With his Reiatsu reserves, Kisuke doubted the child would gain any semblance of control. Mosoki's pretty brown eyes flickered to Kisuke with something imminent and worried, the kind that pleaded for an answer when all other avenues of research had been explored. Kisuke nodded once in understanding. Ichigo at that moment returned his attention to the adults, brown eyes flickering between Kisuke and Mosoki before he tugged on Kisuke's much larger calloused hand and with a blinding grin ordered, "Come on. You have to hear about what we found in the garden yesterday." Kisuke let the small hand tug him into the living room. The TV was off and the back door was open, a pleasant breeze spilling into the room. Mosoki followed Ichigo's eager steps with a muffled grin and gracefully walked over to the pen at one side of the room, gently setting the twin girls down. Karen glared at Mosoki for a moment with all the venom a toddler could possess, while Yuzu distracted herself with the toys. Ichigo settled on the couch with a jump and a push, wiggling back so that he was seated like a king upon his throne. The child tugged Kisuke beside him as Mosoki disappeared into the kitchen for a moment. The former captain of the Gotei 13 listened as the child in front of him babbled about the caterpillar they had found in the garden and how their mother said it would be happy if it lived outside rather than inside, and how caterpillars would one day become butterflies because they went through something called metamorphosis, and they had learned that in school, and as Ichigo paused to take a breath, chatty in the way most kids were when they had something to share, Kisuke interjected, "Nay Ichigo, you're taking karate lessons, right?" Brown eyes blinked up at Kisuke wide and bright in a way that tugged at the former Onmitsuki member's heartstrings and reminded Kisuke why there were various projects on hold, so he could sit and listen to this small child talk. Ichigo nodded with a blinding grin, his eyes flickering briefly to his mother still in the kitchen before Ichigo leaned closer to Kisuke and responded as if telling a secret. "Yep, Jusan wanted me to take the lessons. Carson didn't like the idea, but Jusan said it would teach me how to protect Karen and Yuzu. Carson said yes, but if I don't like it then I can quit." Ichigo whispered before leaning back with a smile with all the force of the sun. Kisuke nodded with a small secretive grin of his own at the information, even as underneath he processed what the conversation innocently relayed. Isshin wanted a son who took after the Shiba name, strong and able to fight, all attributes that would be well suited in the, now derelict, plans to defeat Aizen. They had needed strength and power. But Ichigo was at heart a mixture of both his mother and father, fierce and protective, but with a softness and naivety to him that would challenge Ichigo as he grew. It left Kisuke to wonder at the way Ichigo's personality would shift, how he would weather the storm slowly creeping along the horizon. Karen was her father's son and Yuzu her mother's, but Ichigo was something of a hybrid. "Do you like karate lessons, Ichigo?" Kisuke questioned after a second where the child's eyes had unfocused to seat themselves on the seat to the direct left of the scientist. Ichigo blinked once, brown eyes focusing on Kisuke before a frown drew the child's eyebrows down, and Ichigo responded, "It's fun to learn all of the moves. But Tatsuki, one of the girls at the dojo, always beats me no matter what." The uncle made a sound of consolation at the information, which spread a smile across Ichigo's features. A second later, Mosoki appeared from the kitchen, something soft to her eyes as she called out to her son, "Ichigo, why don't you go and see if the caterpillar you found is still in the garden so you can show Kisuke?" Ichigo glanced at his mother with an excited grin at the mention of the soon-to-be butterfly, and with a flutter of a wave at Kisuke the child darted out into the backyard. Kisuke watched for a moment, his eyes falling on the twins as they babbled to each other in the broken English of young toddlers. Mosoki, leaning against the doorway, smiled with a tilt of her head and beckoned the former captain to enter her domain. The kitchen was perfumed with the scent of various spices as a pot boiled over the stove, accompanied by a pan with sizzling fish. Mosoki briefly checked on the food with a careful eye before she passed a steaming cup of tea to Kisuke and leaned against the counter. The scientist mimicked the motion, sipping at the hot liquid and basking in the feeling of warmth that seemed to saturate the Kurosaki household. "Where's Isshin, still in the clinic?" Kisuke questioned, and Mosoki frowned for a moment, her eyes long and dark before they returned to the rice, and she responded, "Yes, he's working late again today. I still don't understand why he chose this practice of all things. He could have run a convenience store. But no, Shiba men and their hero complete, right, Kisuke?" The scientist in question muffled a snort of laughter into the sleeves of his yukata and nodded along, understanding well Mosoki's complaints. The young mother smiled ruefully for a second before her gaze flickered to Ichigo, who was talking to himself again. "I bet Ichigo will be in the kitchen with you the next time I visit," Kisuke commented, lightly watching as Mosoki turned and stirred the rice in the pot. The young mother nodded, a loving expression furrowing her brow as she responded, "You're probably right, like always, Kisuke. He's a bit of a mother's boy, but I can't fault Ichigo. I just worry about what would happen if..." Mosoki paused, her eyes darting out the window to follow Ichigo as he searched the leaves before, after a prgnnt pause, she continued, "His awakening. Riken S felt it too." The word seemed to bring a sudden chill to the cozy kitchen, raising the hair on the back of Kisuke's neck and digging icy claws into his limbs. Mosoki's lips were quirked into a frown, and there was something cold and terribly afraid in her eyes. Kisuke contemplated what those words meant. If her bark were to awaken, it could spell the end of Soul Society and the mortal world in one fell swoop. Part of the scientist was thankful that he had been given an advanced warning. But another part of Kisuke wondered if it would all come to rest on Ichigo's shoulders regardless. Mosoki's eyes connected once with Kisuke's before she glanced away, tangling a finger through her hair and watching her son again. Kisuke sipped at the tea in his hands and let the silence linger for a moment before he added, "He's talking to this lady in red more often, isn't he?" The young mother stirred the pot in silence, water bubbling like a marching band as she nodded and replied, "Yes, but rarely when you aren't around." The scientist processed the information and was left to wonder. It wasn't a plus soul that much any Shinigami with Reiatsu could see, nor was it a hollow. Kisuke's deductions left few alternate solutions. "You're sure it isn't an imaginary friend? You did say they were common at this age," Kisuke commented, sipping at the tea in his hands. Mosoki pursed her lips and peered through the small window in the kitchen to see the twins before she returned to facing Kisuke. With a shake of her head, the young matriarch replied, "No, I don't think so. The Red Lady tells him things he couldn't possibly know on his own." "Like what?" Kisuke questioned softly, staring into the tea as his mind went to work analyzing the clues given to them. Mosoki shrugged in a helpless manner and replied, "Things like how nobility would act in the Edo PRD, noble clans, the strict laws that often govern Japan then. It's possible he could have read that in a book." The scientist suggested, only for Mosoki's eyes to WHP towards Kisuke, and in a sudden flare of temper the mother snapped, "Damn it, Kisuke, he's 5, only to subside with a helpless sigh that belayed the worry the mother was feeling. Kisuke watched as Ichigo crouched in the bushes. He could feel the kid's Reiatsu even from inside the house, powerful enough already to call hollows to him. Taking a slow sip of his tea as Mosoki stirred the pot, he added, "Your family, the last time they interacted with Shinigami was in the Edo PRD, right?" The young matriarch glanced up warily but nodded, and Kisuke continued, "It might be likely that due to Ichigo's genetics, he has the ability to see Zanpakuto spirits. The Red Lady could very well be my own spirit Benihime." Mosoki stared for a moment in shock before her gaze flickered to Ichigo, who was talking to thin air. The woman's gaze became speculative for a moment. Her fingers gripping the counter were a pale white as she asked, "Could you confirm it with your Zanpakuto spirit?" Kisuke nodded once and wondered how Benihime would respond. At that moment, the door to the backyard slid open with a whoosh and a hiss, and Ichigo ran inside. He paused once to talk to the twins before appearing at the doorway to the kitchen. Kisuke nodded once to Mosoki and followed Ichigo into the sunlight, listening as the child described the cocoon the butterfly was in. It was cold, so cold the kind that drilled itself through the very marrow of your bones in a way that felt like it wouldn't ever be warm again, like the sun had fled. It was cold, and the sound of rain poured down around Ichigo, soaking his clothing and hair, and driving that cold deep inside of him. The sound of the droplets was like a clock ticking out every second as his hands, covered in red, such a deep watery red, pressed over his mom's stomach. She was bleeding from great big gashes on her stomach that reminded Ichigo of the patients that were carted into his dad's office after the large car crash. It reminded Ichigo of the cat they found behind the school and tried to save. Ichigo took a great shuddering, heaving sob, the taste of salt heavy on his lips as he put pressure on the wound, red running over his fingers and staining the ground around them. He remembered it, the ginormous lumbering creature that had appeared where the little girl had stood, so close to the edge of the river bank, so close to falling into the rapid waters that even now roared and churned around Ichigo. He had known it was a spirit, his mother had warned him too in that fond tone. But for one split second, Ichigo had stepped forward to warn the girl of the danger, something inside him screaming about it all the while in an incoherent babble like how the twins used to speak. The grass had been slicked with rain, and it had only taken a second before Ichigo was rolling down the hill towards the girl, and towards the river, churning and hungry. It had happened so quickly it felt like a blur, like a whirlwind and a gasp. His mom was there, her hair pale and glowing in the dim light, the creature all shadow and hunger, something bright blue that snapped like lightning and swallowed everything, a pressure searing and heavy, then his mother lying on top of him, and the creature was gone. Ichigo could feel the wounds, the ones that were beneath his hands pulsing BLD, and the ones that he couldn't see. He wanted to do something, felt it bubbling beneath the surface as if that power inside of him, the wisps he saw at the corner of his vision would help. That it would knit together the broken skin beneath his fingers. But he couldn't reach it. It was like a dream with a road that kept winding on, and every step closer was another step further. A sob tore itself from Ichigo's throat. He could feel his mom slipping away, like a flame guttering in the rain that kept falling around him, pounding an endless tempo. He couldn't do anything. He didn't know how to fit. He couldn't fit. Tears poured down Ichigo's cheeks and mixed with the rain as he continued to apply pressure to the wound like his father told him when they talked about the cat. There were sirens in the distance, and the churn of the river was attempting to drown out Ichigo's thoughts and leave only the cold, the soul-sucking cold. Suddenly, his mom twitched, her eyes flickered open, soft brown once the light, the warmth, like the sun of his world, fading and filled with pain. Her hand shakily rose to cup his cheek, brushing a thumb over it in a soothing gesture. There was a faint smile at the corner of her lips, one that promised 1,000 things Ichigo wouldn't understand till he was older, something like an apology and hope. Then, her hand slumped and the beat of her heart was gone. Ichigo laid his head against her chest and listened desperately, wished the rain would stop, wished he couldn't feel the dull cold seeping deeper and deeper when he checked her pulse. Ichigo froze, and he called softly, "Mom," and then more desperately in a breathless scream. But there was no reply. Ichigo lifted his hands from the wound, looked at the BLD on his hands and sobbed, shaking, breathless, screaming, sobs. He'd never hear his mother's voice, feel her arms around him, watch as she moved around the kitchen with an airy grace, hear her read a story, or have her kisses goodbye. Ichigo sobbed and felt a weight wrap around him, something harsh and white appearing in the corner of his vision for a moment, heavy and real and there. But the rain was drowning everything in dull shades of grey, and Ichigo couldn't help the tears joining the cold water dressing him head to toe as he folded over his mother, the vague impression of a hand on his head there. The first responders arrived, the rain pouring around them, but it was too late. Ichigo was hunched over his mother as if he might protect her, and sobs racked the chilly evening air muffled by the heavy rain. Ichigo stared at the swirls of wood that made up the surface of the dining table. He traced them with his eyes mindlessly, drifting in a numb state of emptiness. The child knew the world was still moving around him, that his twin sisters, his baby sisters who he was supposed to protect and care for, were curled together asleep with drying tear tracks on the couch. But Ichigo couldn't move. It was like there were blocks of stone on his feet, or like in the stories his mom had told him, it was like he had been turned to stone. It hurt, a raw cold, stealing hurt that beat in Ichigo's chest and stung his eyes, and that made his lips quiver and his fingers clench. Because she was never coming back. It was because of Ichigo. He was the one who had tripped, he was the one who wasn't able to save her even when there was time. Ichigo stared at the swirls of wood that made up the surface of the dining table and let his existence continue to drift. A click sounded throughout the empty Kurosaki home, loud as a gunshot and just as volatile. The sound was accompanied by 2 pairs of footsteps, and Ichigo acknowledged the sound with a flicker of his eyes before returning his gaze to the table. His father entered first, a sway to his movements, bags beneath his eyes, and shoulders dragged down by the weight of his sudden loss. Kisuke followed behind the father, his hat tipped down to shade his eyes as he surveyed the home with sad eyes. Ichigo peered from beneath his hair at his father, who leaned against the kitchen counter. The child blinked for a moment. There was something around his father. It flickered like a flame but was weak and faint even to Ichigo's eyes. Something inside the child, a part of him buried beneath the grief, questioned if that flicker was like the lady in red. Kisuke settled at the table across from Ichigo with a screech of the chair legs that was jarring and brittle. Ichigo's attention flickered to his uncle and then flickered to the lady in red. She was appealing in the way his mother had been, but sharper, as if everything about her was hyper-defined. She had an ornate red kimono, long black hair twisted into an elegant hairstyle, and eyes that were frighteningly intelligent and hungry. When he had first met her, she had been aloof and barely spoke to him. But that had changed over time and with Ichigo's determined persistence. The lady in red was smiling at him now. It wasn't the toothy smile that highlighted the curve of her lips, it was something that pulled at the corner of her eyes and was fragile like porcelain. Ichigo's eyes flickered to Kisuke. The man's eyes were watery, his hair was a mess, and his permanent 5 o'clock shadow was also a mess, and back to the lady in red. Usually, his uncle was a very crafty man who was very good at playing hide and seek with his emotions, but when Ichigo looked to the lady in red, it wasn't strong to tell what the man was actually feeling. Ichigo didn't need that today. Ichigo stared at the swirls of wood that made up the surface of the dining table. It was becoming dark out. Ichigo would have sat on the river bank until the moon was in the sky, watching the water flow onto itself in the same manner as his thoughts. But his father had found him, and tonight was the night of the funeral. Ichigo didn't have the energy to throw a tantrum. He couldn't, not when the twins were looking to him, so he stared at the table. Kisuke coughed once, the sound overbearing and harsh like the rasp of two weak lungs trying to take in air, and Ichigo glanced first to the lady in red, then to Kisuke. The man tipped his hat to shade his eyes, and stated in a voice rough with emotion, "We'll be leaving soon, Ichigo." The words felt stilted as if each syllable had been dragged through molasses. Ichigo only nodded and returned his attention to the wood in front of him. He heard his uncle sigh and the too loud screech of the chair sliding back. They spoke in hushed whispers, Kisuke and his father, as Ichigo stared at the swirls of wood. They spoke about the truth, and Isshin thanked the scientist for being there for his family and ignored the guilt in his friend's eyes. The funeral was black, like the skies outside, overcast and heavy with the rain that had begun to pour as soon as they exited the house. Ichigo hated the rain. Everyone was dressed in black and words of consolation drifted through the air like an out-of-tune lullaby. It all felt like a blur, like when the rain got on a drawing with markers and everything just blurred together. Ichigo remembered another boy, one with black hair and glasses. Ichigo remembered the way the twins clung to him, their tiny hands wrapped in his own, the way they sniffled, and the sight of it all seemed to drive home the fact for the first time that their mom was never coming home again. Because of Ichigo. He remembered standing in the rain, feeling the cold seep into his clothing, seep beneath his skin and into his bones as if it wouldn't ever go away. He remembered the car ride home and the stilted silence that wouldn't go away and the darkness of the world around the car. Ichigo returned to sitting at the dining room table in the harsh fluorescence of the overhanging light as his father tucked the twins into bed. Kisuke entered the dining room from the kitchen with two mugs in his hands and wisps of pale steam that felt invisible in the harsh light. The mugs were set on the table with a dull clink, one in front of Ichigo and one in front of Kisuke. It smelt like chamomile and mom. There was something stuck in Ichigo's throat and burning behind his eyes, and it felt like it wanted to escape. Then suddenly, there were arms wrapping around Ichigo, and he glanced into the gold-on-black eyes of the spirit who appeared that night. He was all white and he looked like Ichigo, but he was not Ichigo, but he was Ichigo's. The spirit's eyes were warm, and his body was warm at that moment, and Ichigo felt like he was wearing a blanket. Ichigo glanced up when he heard the clink of the mug settling on the table, glanced into his uncle's eyes, and took a sip of his own tea. It was hot, almost unbearably so, and chased the chill from his veins. Kisuke sighed, dragging a hand over his features and messing his hair up so it looked like a bird's nest. The lady in red was giggling, and Ichigo wondered what Aunt Yoruichi would say if she saw him. "Ichigo, do you know what happened that night?" Kisuke asked tentatively and quietly, as if he might fell a tree with the words alone. The air was suddenly cold again, and Ichigo felt as if he was in one of those cop shows and he was in the interrogation room. The child glanced at his hands and nodded, his brow creased and the lump in his throat returned with vengeance. His spirit leaned heavily on Ichigo's shoulders, and he glanced up once and saw unending support in those mismatched eyes. One of the bad spirits attacked and hurt Kar-san, and I couldn't save her. Ichigo responded and hated the way his voice sounded in the silence of the kitchen. Kisuke flinched as if he had been physically hurt by Ichigo's words, and the thought struck at Ichigo like a stray bullet. He took a sip of the too hot tea and studied the swirls of wood in the table. "It wasn't your fault, Ichigo. Mosoki, your mother died to save you. She would never allow your life over hers. It wasn't your fault that you couldn't heal her or treat her wounds," Kisuke said, and Ichigo dropped the mug in his hands. It dropped onto the table with a clatter and wobbled, spilling hot tea onto Ichigo's hands before righting itself. The child hissed at the light burn, and in an instant, Kisuke was beside Ichigo holding his hands. The spirit, who was not Ichigo but looked like him, hissed in the same manner and wrapped his arms more tightly around Ichigo, his warmth seeping into the smaller body. Ignoring the pain, Ichigo stared into Kisuke's eyes and asked, "Was there a way I could have healed her?" Kisuke made a soft sound as he cradled Ichigo's hands. His grey eyes flickered up once to meet Ichigo's as the lady in red hovered beside his uncle. A soft green glow surrounded his uncle's hands, and suddenly Ichigo felt a warmth spread through his hands where Kisuke's hovered above them. The warmth seemed to travel through his veins like drinking a mug of hot chocolate on a winter's day. For the first time in a week, Ichigo felt real and truly warm again. There were tears dripping down Ichigo's cheeks, and he wondered when he had started to cry. Wide-eyed stared into Kisuke's own, and his uncle bowed his head for a moment at the emotion there before he surged forth and hugged Ichigo. The child in question stared in wonder at the green glow surrounding his hands, the way it rippled like a stone thrown into a pond.
"Could you teach me this?"
"Teach me how to be strong enough to protect my family so it never happens again." Ichigo asked, brown eyes, the same that had glanced into Kisuke's soul, glanced into Kisuke's grey eyes, aged and wise. The former captain of the 12th Division studied the determination of the child in front of him, the tears streaming down Ichigo's cheeks, thought of the desolation he had seen because he had been too late, and nodded. A small body buried into Kisuke's own and began to sob. Kisuke closed his eyes and wrapped his arms around Ichigo. For a second he thought he could feel the warmth of something else. Ichigo gasped for breath as he rolled over the rough terrain, trying to minimize the damage by tucking his arms into his chest as he clung tightly to the shinai in his hands. Rolling to a stop, Ichigo coughed the taste of dust out of his mouth and let his eyes flicker open to warily survey his surroundings. Rising to his feet, Ichigo tried to search the terrain with his Ryatsu, but it was useless. There was so much of it that it was sort of like trying to direct an ocean through a funnel. Instead, Ichigo used his eyes surveying the rocky towers that made up the underground training area. The fake sky overhead was a clear blue with fluffy clouds floating around. It almost instilled a false sense of peace. Ichigo whirled around as his instincts buzzed in awareness, his shinai raised to block as his uncle appeared in a blur of the Shinigami art, Shiimpa. As Ichigo caught Kisuke's shinai on his own, struggling against the greater weight before shifting his stance, Ichigo recalled the first time he had seen the training area under the shiten. It had been awe-inspiring, as if he had traveled to another world, or like his uncle had a pocket dimension. Kisuke had chuckled and ruffled Ichigo's hair, understanding in his eye. That had been followed by a practically evil grin as he tossed him a shinai. Ichigo had fumbled and caught the weighted wooden stick with a confused look until his uncle explained that protecting his family wasn't just about healing. Darting back a few steps in the rough Shuenpa Yoruichi had taught him when they played tag, Ichigo adjusted his grip on the shinai and flew forward. Kisuke's grey eye seemed to glow from beneath his striped bucket hat as Ichigo appeared in front of his uncle. Their wooden weapons clanged together with a loud clatter as Ichigo used his overhead strike and the force of gravity to push against his uncle, who was unfairly strong compared to Ichigo's 8-year-old body. A strong kick landed in Ichigo's solar plexus, sending the child flying backwards only to land in a roll and spring to his feet, shinai at the ready. Kisuke nodded, his lips curved very faintly into a smile that was hardly noticeable if one didn't know the man's tells. With a nod, Kisuke commented, "That was a good roll, Ichigo. You transformed the kinetic energy well. Remember to keep your guard up at all times, all right?" Ichigo nodded and watched as Kisuke demonstrated how Ichigo could use the hilt of his shinai as part of his guard but also his elbows. When the former Shinigami knew that Ichigo understood, he tipped his head once and then flew forward. With a whirl of air, Ichigo dodged to the side and attempted to hit the striped hat off of Kisuke's head. So far, he had been unsuccessful, but he wouldn't give up. Ducking under the overhead swing, Kisuke retaliated. Ichigo listened to the whisper of his spirit's voice and used rough flash step to appear behind Kisuke. His uncle knew Ichigo was there, so Ichigo feinted to the side and used Shuenpa again to appear in Kisuke's personal space. There was a terrifying grin on his uncle's features, one that was almost scarily reminiscent of Benihime. Ichigo looked down and had a split second to bring his shinai to his chest before a Kido exploded in front of him. It was bright crimson red, and Ichigo was pretty sure it was Shaka as he flew back, rolling into a ball and colliding with a stone pillar in a cloud of dust. Ichigo was well familiar with the feeling of Shaka. So far, Ichigo had only learned a few Kido from Tessai because his Reiatsu made it difficult to not overpower the spell. But Kisuke was adamant that they were still used during training. For a moment, as Ichigo coughed out the dust filling the air, he would have to stop that. Kisuke said it gave away his position. He contemplated surrendering and ending the spar. But Ichigo couldn't afford to give up. He had to keep going, had to keep fighting, had to get stronger so he could protect his sisters. A shinai cut through the cloud of dust and Ichigo darted into Shuenpa from a low crouch, appearing behind his uncle with his shinai raised. Kisuke turned lightning fast and he directed the pommel of his shinai towards Ichigo's gut. Turning in mid-air, Ichigo landed in a crouch and shot forward, colliding with Kisuke's shinai in a flurry of motion. The two exchanged blows, moving back and forth across the training area for a moment as Ichigo worked on his extended reach and tried to keep up with his uncle's viper-like movements. In a quick flick of motion that was strong for Ichigo to follow, Kisuke twisted his shinai and suddenly the training sword in Ichigo's hand went flying. Panting, Ichigo registered the wooden blade resting at his neck, the sweat like a cold sheet on his back, and the flicker of pride he could detect in his uncle's eyes. "You have to teach me that move, it was awesome." "Please, uncle." "Kisuke?" Ichigo asked with wide eyes and a blinding grin. Kisuke scoffed and dropped the shinai resting against Ichigo's neck. With a shake of his head, the man stroked the stubble on his chin for a moment. Ichigo frowned impatiently at his uncle's actions and focused the full force of his puppy eyes on the man. Kisuke studied Ichigo imperiously for a moment, eyes narrowed in challenge. Finally, with a laugh, he ruffled Ichigo's hair and replied, "Next spar, okay, Ichigo? For now, let's review as we cool down, okay?" The orange-haired child, the color similar to his mother's in the pale afternoon light, nodded with a blinding smile that made something inside Kisuke's chest ache. Ichigo was adapting well. He was in many ways a prodigy. It left Kisuke wondering if he still wasn't following through on his old plan regardless of intention. With a nod from his uncle in the direction of the lost shinai, Ichigo raced over and picked up the heavy training implement before joining Kisuke as he moved to another section of the training area. Ichigo hummed happily under his breath as the two settled on the ground and began to stretch, reaching out to touch their toes or twisting behind them. Ichigo liked stretching after a spar, and sometimes Kisuke would explain what muscle they were stretching and how it was connected to the body. "You did well today with your technique, Ichigo." Kisuke began catching Ichigo's attention and continuing once he had it. "I saw that you adjusted your stance a few times. Never be afraid to do that in the middle of battle. It's important when you're facing different opponents to consider their strength and size. For example, if you were to fight someone your own size, you would need to adjust your reach and wouldn't need to deepen your stance as much because your opponent wouldn't have the height advantage." Ichigo nodded as they moved to another stretch, processing the information and the words with a careful nod. When Ichigo blinked, he could see Benihime and his spirit talking to each other in the shade of the pillar. "Remember to protect your core when we're fighting. You have the habit of leaving yourself open. Also, I noticed you were attempting to strategize today. Keep doing that, Ichigo. Always try to stay 3 steps ahead of your opponent. If you can predict what they're going to do, it makes it easier to respond in the best manner possible." Kisuke finished as he settled in a Caesar position. Ichigo mirrored the action and acknowledged his uncle's words with a nod, eyes determined where they stared at his mentor. Kisuke smiled softly for a moment as he surveyed Ichigo before with a cough the man stated, "Well, let's move on to healing our bruises, eh?" Ichigo nodded energetically and scooted closer to Kisuke, extending his arms so his mentor could survey the damage. With a furrow to his brow, Kisuke asked, "Have you talked to your dad about learning first aid yet?" Shifting awkwardly for a moment, Ichigo studied his arms and bit his lip. After a second, where his spirit nudged him to answer, Ichigo replied, "I've tried talking to him. But it feels like we're having 2 different conversations. I feel as if we're yelling at each other over a huge cliff." Kisuke shook his head for a moment, his eyes shaded beneath the brim of the hat, one of his hands clenching at his side even as the other stroked the stubble on his chin. Benihime, where she was talking to Ichigo's spirit, stiffened her spine straight as iron for a moment. Even from a distance, Ichigo could feel her bloodlust. After a minute, Ichigo's uncle glanced up and must have noticed the guilt on Ichigo's features because he quickly assured, "It's not your fault, Ichigo. Try again a few times, and if he still isn't communicating very well, you can always grab some of the textbooks in his office and we can go over them together, okay? Ichigo nodded, a small smile on his lips and something mischievous in his eyes at the thought of sneaking into his dad's office. Ichigo had learned that look from Kisuke. The man in question hummed to himself for a moment before he asked, "Are you ready to try and heal the bruises and the cut on your arm?"
Do you remember how healing Kido works, Ichigo?
Shifting one hand over his arm, Ichigo focused on the endless Reiatsu inside of him. He thought of how he wanted to accelerate the reproduction of the cells as Kisuke had stated. Ichigo thought of that night in the rain, that feeling that had been seared just beneath his fingertips, and with a soft exhale Ichigo let the Reiatsu flow around his fingers. When he opened his eyes, the soft green glow was there, shimmery like water. Ichigo guided it over the cut on his arm and focused on how he wanted the cells in his body to react. "Pretty soon, Tessai will have to take over your training, Ichigo."
"I'm only good for minor injuries at best, I'm afraid,"
Kisuke stated, and Ichigo shifted his eyes up, continuing the healing as he responded, "Really? Like how you insisted Yoruichi teach me Shorinpa?" Ichigo's uncle nodded with a huff of laughter and a shake of his head, something amused and resigned in the gesture. A peaceful silence fell between the two for a moment. Kisuke watched Ichigo with sharp eyes and asked, "Have you had any luck in entering your inner world during meditation?" "No." Ichigo responded with a dejected shrug as he switched the Kido to his other hand and started healing the bruises on his other arm. Kisuke smiled encouragingly and responded, "Don't worry, Ichigo. Some Shinigami take their whole life to do so. And besides, I think you have a bit of an advantage. So, you'll be there in no time." With a glance upwards, Ichigo caught the waggle of his uncle's eyebrows, and giggles tumbled helplessly from his lips as he turned his attention to his spirit, who was grinning. The grin looked bloodthirsty, but Ichigo knew it was meant to be supportive. "Oh, that reminds me, Kisuke. Guess what happened this week?" Ichigo asked with bright eyes, the pale green of the Kido reflecting like waves on his features. Kisuke quirked a brow and leaned forward to daringly question, "What?" "Yuzu helped me in the kitchen. It wasn't much, because she is not touching the knives for a while. But she helped me wash the vegetables and stir the pot." The youth replied with a bright grin, something of his mother in his features. Kisuke grinned, his expression fractured with something bitter for a moment before it was gone. Studying his student's arms, Kisuke replied, "You should ask Tessai for some of his recipes." "Ah, I think you're done healing, Ichigo. Good job." Ichigo beamed at the praise and rose to his feet alongside Kisuke, joining his uncle as they made their way to the ladder in a peaceful silence. After a minute, Ichigo shifted nervously and in a quiet voice asked, "Kisuke, do you think there's anything we can do about my Reiatsu? I don't want to attract any of the bad spirits, I mean hollows. I don't want them to hurt Yuzu and Karen, or anyone else I care about." Kisuke slowed in his pace at Ichigo's words, turning a considering eye on the child at his side. Settling a hand on Ichigo's shoulder, the former captain of the 12th Division responded, "We'll figure something out, Ichigo. Maybe we'll spread your Reiatsu out like a very thin blanket so it's everywhere. Maybe we'll funnel it into a pocket dimension. In the meantime, Ichigo, don't worry, you have your spirit with you and I'll always be watching out for you. The same with Yoruichi and Tessai." Ichigo glanced up, something pensive in his gaze for a moment before he nodded with a small smile. Kisuke grinned as they arrived at the ladder and with a cheery tone said, "Come on, we can probably have a cup of tea before we must return you home." It was raining, a thick misty rain that shrouded everything in a haze, leaving only indistinct shapes. Ichigo wondered why it had to rain on the anniversary of that date. He felt as if the mist outside was inside of him, tangling with his emotions and leaving only the mist. It was a blur as he packed a small picnic basket, as he packed umbrellas and the like. The house felt cold, empty. For the first few months afterwards, it had been like that, as if no one lived there, just ghosts. But eventually, Yuzu had started smiling again, Karen had returned with a vicious temper, and Isshin had descended into goofy antics as if it might lighten the mood. It helped somewhat. It was their father who had suggested visiting her grave, something tired and heavy in the man's eyes at the dinner table the night before. Part of Ichigo hadn't wanted to go, didn't want to face the reality. But he needed to pay his respect to his mother, needed to tell of how much he had improved, how he was protecting his sisters, and how much they were growing up. Yuzu, a burgeoning housekeeper already, and she reminded him wretchedly and fondly of his mother, had created a list of food to make and left the complicated work to her older brother. Ichigo was quite certain Yuzu was digging around in the attic with Karen if the occasional thump and bump was any indication. He wondered what they would find up there. Ichigo had only been up there once and it had been filled with old artifacts and furniture. He glanced at the clock on the wall and wondered when Isshin would come in from his shift in the clinic, then they could leave. It was an hour later that Ichigo climbed the stairs to the attic. He found Yuzu and Karen hunched over something and dressed in old clothing. The older brother grinned at the innocent glances they flashed his way and told them to come downstairs before leaving them to their mystery. It made him happy to see them actually happy again. The grass was slippery and sloshed underneath Ichigo's shoes as they climbed up the hill, a parade of umbrellas, all in bright and fun colors, over their heads. Yuzu was holding onto Ichigo's hand as they climbed each step with a jump and a hop. Karen was in front of them trudging along with arms crossed. She would glance back every few minutes with an expectant look but also to make sure they were still there. Isshin was the caboose following his children with slow measured movements, a cigarette between his teeth and smoke in the air. The graveyard was empty. Ichigo thought he could see a lone umbrella far in the back, but that was it. Up high the air was colder and the rain felt less like a hailstorm. Perhaps it had slowed a bit. It took the Kurosaki family a few minutes to find the grave, whether that was due to memory or the mists Ichigo didn't want to decide. Crouching down with Yuzu beside him, Ichigo carefully showed his sister how to pull the weeds gently from the earth around the grave, how to brush away the dirt stuck between the crevices of her name, and finally how to place the flowers. It was methodical and cathartic in a sense. Karen watched with their father, her arms crossed over her chest and something lost in her eyes. Ichigo rested his hand against the engraved letters as Yuzu moved back to crock her arm with Karen's. He traced the letters with his eyes, and for a moment just breathed and thought of his mom, her smile, her laugh, the color of her hair, her eyes, all of it. After a minute, Ichigo stepped back. The knees of his pants were soaked, and he could almost feel a familiar chill settling there and drifting everywhere else. Ichigo settled underneath a tree a short distance away and let Karen and Yuzu talk to Mom. Isshin stood behind the girls, a silent guardian, and in the mists, Ichigo could see the faint flickers of something around the man. With a rush of warm air, Ichigo's spirit appeared beside him, those golden eyes surveying the area carefully even as one hand ruffled Ichigo's hair. They both felt it, a chill on the back of Ichigo's neck, the way his hair bristled. He didn't have to wonder what it was. Ichigo attempted to use his Reiatsu to track the hollow, to find if it was near his family. But it was useless. His own Reiatsu was as concealing as the mist around him. His spirit, as if noticing his frustration, gently grasped Ichigo's hand and tugged him forward. They moved together in a rough shuimpa as Ichigo's hand fumbled for the small phone Kisuke had given him for emergencies as the rain pounded around them. He dialed the number, hearing it ring underneath the sound of the rain as they entered a clearing. There was a lady on the ground, an umbrella lying a few feet away as she cowered in terror. There was a hollow in the clearing, the same harsh white as his spirit, but less human, like someone had attempted to create an animal without a reference picture and had only managed to capture the raw hunger. For a split second, Ichigo knew he could leave, could pretend nothing had ever happened. His family would be safe and Kisuke would arrive eventually. Ichigo couldn't do that. He couldn't back away and let an innocent woman lose her life, not when he had the power to protect people. His spirit hummed Reiatsu, thrumming in the air as pale bone-white hands clasped over Ichigo's own. The sword that materialized was almost translucent, a katana that reflected Ichigo's appearance in the mist. For a moment, Ichigo felt the power in front of him and studied the hollow. It was large with a bulky body, which meant it would rely on strength and would be slower than Ichigo. "Are you ready, Ichigo?" His spirit asked, and Ichigo muffled his surprise at hearing the raspy dual-tone voice for the first time. Ichigo had known he would hear it eventually. Instead, Ichigo nodded, and as one being they cut through the air and rain, appearing in front of the hollow. Ichigo knew the mask was the weak spot on a hollow, so he used his height to attempt to bisect the creature. The hollow turned at the last moment, cold beastly eyes centering on Ichigo as a large fist swung outwards, batting him into a tree. Ichigo coughed and rose to his feet, adjusting his grip on the katana in his hands. He inhaled. Inside, Ichigo was shaking. He was terrified, but he couldn't turn back. He had to keep moving forward. If he did that, he didn't deserve to be called it Ichigo. "You can do this, Ichigo. Call my name. Move forward." His spirit assured that Warbly, voice clear with conviction as gold eyes connected with his own. Ichigo had felt his spirit's name in his soul when he had tried to reach his inner world, on that night in the rain. But it had always lingered on the tip of his tongue, just out of reach. Ichigo needed that power now, needed to be able to protect his family and move forward. As the hollow began to lumber forward, Ichigo channeled his Reiatsu and whispered, "Zangetsu." The blade in his hand didn't change. Ichigo knew this wasn't his full Shikai, not yet, his body wasn't ready. But Ichigo felt Zangetsu's hands wrap around his own, felt the way his Reiatsu was suddenly funneled into the blade, into his hands, a measure of control slicing itself through the air in a sharp chill. As one being they moved into the air, and with a downward strike an arc of Reiatsu cut the hollow in half. Ichigo landed panting and gasping at his breath as his body protested. The sword in Ichigo's hands faded to translucence at the same moment as the hollow disappeared, and Ichigo felt Zangetsu's pride before the spirit faded into Ichigo's inner world. A ruffle from the bushes snatched Ichigo's attention with wide eyes and a rapid heartbeat even as he stumbled once more. Kisuke stepped out from the bushes, an umbrella over his head and something warm in his eyes as he walked over to Ichigo, who only then realized how utterly soaked he was. Ichigo stiffened for a moment at the arms that wrapped around him before he leaned his head against his uncle's chest and began to cry. He wasn't sure quite why. After a moment, Kisuke pulled back, a faint smile on his lips. Benihime stood protectively behind her wielder and said, "Sorry I'm late, Ichigo, an old friend was being stubborn. Come, we best return before Yuzu gets worried. She is just like your mom in that aspect." He paused for a moment studying Ichigo, then continued, "You did well today." Ichigo nodded with a half smile, exhaustion tugging at his body as he tucked himself into Kisuke and allowed his uncle to carry him like he hadn't since those first few training sessions. Kisuke stared at Ichigo in his arms for a quiet moment and wondered if fate was real. Shinji studied Kisuke, really looked at the man who had saved their asses from Soul Society's definition of mercy. The scientist had been different in recent years, in an almost intangible way. It was hardly noticeable if you didn't know Kisuke. But Shinji knew Kisuke, had shared drinks with him when they had both been captains, when everything had been simpler. The visit supposed it all started with Isshin Shiba and Mosoki Kurosaki. Shinji had known about Isshin, they had almost been captains at the same time. He knew the man was every bit the Shiba he had been raised. Goofy to a fault, overbearing, and with a sense of justice 3 canyons wide. What Shinji didn't know about was Mosoki Kurosaki. Oh, he knew she was a Quincy, that much Kisuke had let slip more than a few times. But that was it. Shinji, for all of his lost pride, wasn't an idiot though. He had left the small family alone even when he heard about the BRTH of Ichigo in reverent detail from both Yoruichi and when did she gush, and Kisuke. Their coup de grace, their mythical savior forged of multiple powerful bloodlines, a 2-month-old baby. Kisuke had confessed later, after insisting Shinji come and meet the kid, and no, he wasn't meeting the kid, they were setting up for slaughter when he'd been deep in his cup. The mastermind behind the whole plot didn't want it anymore. It was laughable if they both didn't know they needed the kid's power to defeat Aizen. So, Shinji and the Wizard had turned their attention away from Ichigo. They would wait till the kid became one of them, if he did. Instead, they had focused on trying to tame their hollows, on trying to keep the monster chained instead. Focused their vengeance, their thoughts on Aizen and not the pain in their soul. Kisuke had come in one night, or sometime early in the morning. His friend, normally composed, even if it was a shabby sort of composed, had appeared with red eyes and shaking hands. There had been guilt in his voice when he explained what had happened to Mosoki Kurosaki, how Kisuke hadn't even tried to save her, not really. Something in Shinji had been sad, but it had been distant in the way that it was sad when Rungakai kids lost their families to the hollow you were hunting. But then Kisuke had slipped a bit, gone off on a tangent and mentioned how Ichigo, Mosoki's child, had the ability to see spirits. The frightening and wondrous all at once, Shinji wasn't sure if he wanted the kid to see his spirit for what it was, for what they had been turned into. They had been sharing sake, Kisuke ruminating with pride over Ichigo's progress, the way the kid was almost a prodigy. The scientist had begun to describe the spirit Ichigo claimed as his when something, some alarm or another had gone off. Shinji had been left with questions about golden eyes and Ichigo Kurosaki. Shinji was cunning, he didn't show it often. It was better to play the rabbit and wait for the wolf to reveal itself. But Shinji wanted to meet the kid he had heard so much about, and if that meant being cunning because Kisuke wanted to wait on a meeting till the kid was ready, well, who was Shinji to disappoint? Leaning against the counter, Shinji absorbed the peculiar atmosphere the Shiten always had. Love had likened it to something funky, and Lisa always regarded the building with curled lips, but Mashiro seemed to love it. He supposed that was because of the candy. A bell rung above the doorway, the sound merry and tinkling. It was new, of that Shinji was certain, but when it had been added he could hardly tell. Shinji always snuck in through the back. The Reiatsu hit him first, wild, untamed, and above all absolutely massive like the black holes Kisuke talked about when he was tipsy enough, sucking in everything around it. Then Shinji saw who was emitting such power, and the irony wasn't lost that it was an 8-year-old kid with bright orange hair and the biggest brown eyes he had ever seen. Shinji had an inkling as to why Kisuke had a problem with his MSTR plan. Ichigo entered first, walking and talking with a happy air, and Kisuke followed behind the kid, a weary look tugging at his features that reminded Shinji of his third seat. Kisuke noticed him first, his spine straightening and those Athena grey eyes flashing underneath the brim of his hat. Shinji grinned, and that was when Ichigo clued into the atmosphere of the room. Those big brown eyes landed on Shinji, observing everything about him before flickering to the side. The child squinted as if straining to see something that wasn't there before slumping in defeat and returning his attention to Shinji. With a sigh, Kisuke stepped into the middle of the space and began the introductions. Ichigo, this is Shinji Hirako, a former captain of the Gotei 13. Shinji, this Ichigo Kurosaki, my student. Ichigo tipped his head down bashfully at Kisuke's words, but grinned at Shinji nonetheless, bouncing forward to look up at him and with all the bluntness any child possessed stated, "There's something about you that's different. Your spirit is hiding, but I caught a glimpse of her. She's kind of like my spirit." Shinji looked to Kisuke for help in deciphering the words, even as something in him shifted uneasily at the kid's perceptiveness and his description of second. Kisuke grinned unrepentantly, and for a split second the wizard wondered if it had been Shinji Kisuke had been protecting in trying to prevent the meeting. "That's interesting. What's your spirit like?" Shinji replied, deciding it was better to indulge Ichigo. The kid in front of him blinked for a moment, his eyes flicking behind him to seek out a spirit before returning to Shinji. With a small smile, Ichigo stated, "He had golden eyes, and he says he's like your spirit. He also said some not nice things that I'm not going to repeat." A wide grin settled on Shinji's lips at the answer. Kisuke sighed and scrubbed a hand over his features in resignation. Ichigo turned to Kisuke with a curious tilt of his head and asked, "Shiro said that there are more people like Shinji-san?" Shinji snorted and decided he liked the kid as Kisuke only groaned and leveled Shinji with a vitriolic glare. The scientist was likely planning his newest experiment. Instead, the scientist nodded and tipped his head towards the sky when Ichigo responded, "Can I meet them?" Kisuke looked like he was about to say no, a not wholly unreasonable plan. Shinji was also minorly in agreement, if only because he didn't want to expose the kid to their inner demons. It was fine and dandy if Ichigo's spirit was nice and tame, but their spirits weren't. At the continuing silence and lack of answer, Ichigo pouted, his hands resting on his hips. The kid declared, "I should be allowed to meet them. Even if their spirits are meanies, they can't hurt me. Besides, it's important to learn from multiple sources. You said that yourself." The scientist's shoulders slumped in defeat, and Shinji tucked away a grin at the expression and instead caught Ichigo's attention and replied, "YA can meet everyone later. For now, YA have training to do. And besides, I think I need to warn them if they're gonna meet YA Ichi." The orange-haired kid frowned for a moment at the offer before he flashed Shinji a bright grin and nodded. Kami, if the kid had those kinds of smiles, Shinji understood why Kisuke's MSTR plans had fallen through. At first glance, the warehouse blended with all the other warehouses in the district. It had the same despondent aura, the same dingy grey paneling, and the same shady alleyways that promised danger. But beneath that, Ichigo could sense more, something humming and living that reminded him of the Urahara Shiten, or even his own home sometimes. It was something Ichigo was beginning to associate with Reiatsu. Shinji grinned, where he was standing beside Ichigo in the early afternoon light, his blonde hair rippled like gold. Kisuke had wanted to come. Ichigo had seen the staring match between the two Shinigami, but Kisuke had been forced to cede the honor to Shinji when one of his inventions had threatened to explode again. Ichigo was just happy that he would be able to meet the rest of the visit, and if he was lucky, their spirits. In his life, he had only met Zangetsu and Benihime. Both had complex personalities, appearances, and motives that, while connected to their wielder, were also independent. Ichigo believed that each Zanpakuto spirit was worthy of being recognized, and therefore, he wanted to meet the other spirits. Shinji had frowned when they discussed a visit, something bitter curling the edges of his lips and furrowing his brow, settling heavy on his shoulders. At that moment, Ichigo had caught the briefest glimpse of the man's spirit. She was something ancient and feline, and below it all a seething mess of emotions. There had been silence for a few moments before Shinji had licked his lips and replied, "Ichigo, our spirits there, not like yours. They're wild and dangerous, they could hurt YA. Maybe not physically, but once they meet YA, they could haunt you. YA shouldn't have to see the darkest parts of our soul." Ichigo hadn't understood because in the end, your soul was a reflection of you, even the parts you didn't want people to see. Personally, Ichigo was adamant that they were approaching everything the wrong way. After all, why would you lock up half of your soul? Ichigo could never imagine doing the same to Zangetsu, even if the spirit had a mouth foul enough to make Kisuke blush. But he hadn't said that because then he definitely wouldn't have been allowed to meet the wizard until he was older. Instead, Ichigo had put all of Benihime's lessons on being sly to weasel his way in. Shiro had cackled like an evil villain in the background when Ichigo had finally weathered the two adults down with a mixture of puppy eyes and logical arguments. So, he was here in front of the warehouse, which wasn't all that it appeared to be. Shinji glanced down once at Ichigo, his spirit flickering briefly into existence before disappearing once more, his eyes intense and piercing, but in a way you couldn't quite grasp as he asked, "Are YA sure, Ichigo? YA don't have tar meet everyone now, they won't mind, well, everyone but Hiyuri." Shiro leaned his arms on Ichigo's head and he could feel the spirit's support. It was true that Ichigo didn't have to meet the wizard now. But patience wasn't built in a day, and Ichigo knew he needed to meet them. The youth nodded once, determination blazing in his eyes that was eerily reminiscent to the former captain of the 10th. Shinji sighed but nodded and stepped forward to press a hand to the air in front of him. With a pulse of Reiatsu, the air in front of them shimmered and a translucent barrier fizzing pale gold in the sunlight flickered into existence. Ichigo stared transfixed at the energy before him as it shifted and lapped over one another, calmful layers of Kido Ichigo had only seen Tessai cast. Shinji laughed, the sound low and rumbling deep in his chest as the man commented in a wry tone, "It's impressive, isn't it?" Tessai taught Hachi when they were in the Kido Corps, but they both differentiated into their own fields. Ichigo nodded, acknowledging the words, even as he knew at the same time that the types of Kido that required high levels of finesse and control, basically all Kido, would never be his forte. Ichigo could handle healing Kido. That was different, something he could visualize and materialize because it was right in front of him. But building a solid structure in your mind and crafting it into existence just didn't compute. Shiro's raspy laughter echoed and bounced around Ichigo's skull, but the spirit said nothing and Ichigo only saw the flash of his too wide grin. Shinji clapped his hands together and, with irony lacing his voice, stated, "Well, that's enough procrastinating. Let's go inside." It was accompanied by a Cheshire grin as the Shinigami gently grasped Ichigo's hand and tugged the both of them inside the barrier. The image of the warehouse didn't waver and disappear when they passed through the barrier, but suddenly, amidst the pool of his own Reiatsu, he could feel the presences of the wizard within the warehouse. Shinji strode confidently forward and Ichigo followed, watching as the man opened the large door with ease and a rough grind of sound that shrieked and spit. The inside of the warehouse had been converted to something like a living space, except for the fact that they took the industrial style a touch too literally. he could feel Zangetsu's amusement at that thought and knew both Zangetsu and Benihime were rubbing off on him. The inside was large, with a few hastily thrown-up walls separating a kitchen from a living room, and what Ichigo presumed were bedrooms. Most of the visitors were seated on the couches, sprawled in various positions as a speaker set off in one corner blasted music that felt like a mibe between jazz and something techno. Ichigo decided he sort of liked it. A few of them glanced up at the doors opening, but when they saw Shinji, and presumably only Shinji, they returned to their previous actions. Shinji grinned something mischievous and fierce as he guided Ichigo forward and placed him in the center of the group's midst. The carpet beneath his feet was blue and had curls of yarn. Ichigo decided to focus on that for a few moments as the silence, interrupted only by the music, continued. After a minute, where Shinji was becoming visibly impatient, one of the visitors glanced up. It was a woman, with narrow glasses, a long braid of dark hair, and a sailor uniform. Her spirit hovered behind her. It had wings that were translucent and glimmered like dew in the warehouse lighting. They wrapped around its body like a kimono, one wrapped over its mouth. It had a tangled mess of silver hair that spilled down its back, and gold eyes. Lisa meet Ichigo Kurosaki, Ichigo meet Lisa. Yadmaru. The woman stiffened and Ichigo felt the full force of her gaze, and that of the others, as she stared at him, critical and assessing all at once. Ichigo stared back, Shiro like a wall of iron behind him even as her spirit shifted agitatedly, Rietsu drifting listlessly. Lisa-san nodded once, something called in her eyes before she returned her attention to the manga in her hands, and her spirit flickered away. Shinji huffed in amusement under his breath before he turned to the next visitor. It was a man with thick hair shaped sort of like a Christmas tree or a porcupine, dark skin, and a pair of glasses on the bridge of his nose, which were tipped up, so he could glimpse Ichigo. The man's spirit hovered behind him. It had a long mask like the only Ichigo had seen in museums, armor like that of a samurai in black adorned with spikes, and trailing sleeves that wisped at the air bound across its chest. Ichigo, this is Love Ikawa, Love, this is Ichigo Kurosaki. Shinji introduced the two with a grin. The visitor glanced once to Shinji with narrowed eyes before he bent down and shook Ichigo's hand with a grin. Ichigo decided immediately that he liked Love, and not just because his spirit was cool. Ichigo had only his instincts and Shinji to protect him when a swirling ball of rage appeared from the rafters. Shinji, holding onto the neck of the visitor's red jacket, sighed as she kicked at him, and lightly reprimanded, "Hiyuri, it's rude to attack people you haven't even introduced yourself to." "Whatever, idiot Baldy," she responded, and the two devolved into what appeared to be a verbal and immature fight. Love sighed, brushing a hand over his features as he commented, "That's Hiyuri. Don't mind the aggressiveness and you should be fine." Ichigo nodded and tried to tear his eyes away from Hiyuri-san's spirit. It was a coiling wisp of shadow with streaks of acrid yellow binding it into a vaguely humanoid shape as it screamed around Hiyuri. Something inside him recoiled at the sight of it, but Zangetsu's hand on his shoulder was enough to settle Ichigo's nerves that he could draw his eyes away from the immature squabble. The youth wondered if all their spirits were like that, locked up or raving mad. He couldn't imagine locking Zangetsu away or feeling that rage for countless hours. It would probably drive him crazy as well. Then again, living as long as the Shinigami did would also drive Ichigo crazy. "Aren't there more of you?" Ichigo questioned, dragging his attention away from the calamity occurring in the corner. Love nodded, shifting the glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. The man responded with a soft smile. "Rose, Mashiro, and Kenshi are sparing and Hachi went out for groceries." It was Shinji's turn, but he ditched that to pick you up, kiddo. Shiro's chuckle surrounded Ichigo's ears as he felt the weight of his spirit's arms on his shoulders. Ichigo nodded, and at that moment Lisa snapped her manga shut and stomped over to Shinji and Hiyuri and with a voice like liquid ice lectured, "Enough. If I have to hear you two squabble one more time today, I will bisect both of you. I swear, trade one idiot drunkard for two children." Shinji pouted even as Hiyuri stuck her tongue out at Lisa's retreating back where the visitor was once more settling on the couch. Shinji rolled his eyes and turned his attention to Ichigo with a wink and stated, "Let's head down to the training area. Mashiro, Kenshi, and Rose are there. Also, Hiyuri, this is Ichigo." Hiyuri scoffed at the introduction and glared at Ichigo, who wisely, or unwisely, decided to ignore her for the moment. With a nod to Love, Shinji stepped forward and led Ichigo through the warehouse, pointing out things as they went before they arrived at a trap door. With a grandiose flourish, Shinji flipped the lid open, a burst of hot air thick with Reiatsu rushed out from the opening and a ladder appeared leading into the golden terrain below. After Ichi, Shinji beckoned, earning a suspicious glare even as Ichigo clambered down the ladder, ignoring Shinji's light-hearted attempts to push him down. The space below the warehouse was remarkably similar to Kisuke's training area, except for the sole fact that there were larger quantities of rubble scattered about the place. They heard the sound of battle, swords clashing, Reiatsu swirling before Ichigo saw it. They rounded a corner to a torrent of wind as a wizard with long curly blonde hair and a hooked mask flew back and collided against a well to the left of them. Shinji whistled a laugh and Ichigo's eyes followed the blonde spirit. It was faint, almost translucent in the artificial light. Its skin was like gold wire wrapped around one another like a living mummy. Those same wires formed a trailing cloak and a mask that hid the golden eyes beneath. The wizard rose from the dust and cleaned the dirt off his suit, ignoring the blood staining his lower abdomen as he flew forward at a Shinigami with grey hair. The Shinigami with grey hair was large and had a mask that covered his entire face. There was a spirit behind the wizard. Its body was attached to the earth, coated in pale grey plates of armor that reminded Ichigo of a praying mantis. The spirit's presence was silent. A cheer caught Ichigo's attention and his gaze flickered to a wizard with bright green hair and a jumpsuit. Her spirit fluttered around her, small and more like a blur of energy. Ichigo could almost hear a light buzzing. The grey-haired wizard was sent flying towards Ichigo, who hastily flash-stepped away even as Shinji stepped forward and caught the man against one arm with a slip of a smile. The three wizards stared at Shinji for a moment before he spoke. "Why don't you all take a break, so I can introduce YA to Ichi?" The grey-haired Shinigami nodded and slumped to the ground, his mask cracking and dissipating, and the green-haired Shinigami bounced over to sit beside him. The Shinigami with the long blonde hair studied Shinji for a moment before he too glided over, the movement unsteady due to the wound in his abdomen. Ichigo, the one with the grey hair, is Kenshi Mugaruma, the excitable lady beside him is Mashiro Kuna, and finally the injured blonde is Rose Toribashi. "Everyone, this is Ichigo Kurosaki," Shinji announced with a flourish of dramatic hand movements. Mashiro-san bounced over to stare at Ichigo for a few moments before she grinned bright and wide in a sort of instantly endearing manner and named him Beritan. Kenshi-san behind her nodded once in greeting, and Ichigo had the impression the man was generally the silent and stoic type. Rose-san grimaced but waved as he pressed a hand to his abdomen. "I can heal that if you'd like," Ichigo offered, watching as his near-translucent spirit hovered protectively over its wielder, flickering and shifting before disappearing. It was like they all couldn't see him. The wizard all paused at Ichigo's offer, and the blonde wizard glanced to Shinji for a long moment before he nodded with something grim in his eyes. Ichigo shuffled forward and watched as the man opened his suit and the blood-stained blouse beneath it. The wound was shallow, and likely hadn't pierced or damaged any internal organs. Taking a breath, Ichigo felt Shiro's presence around him as he channeled his Reiatsu, felt the familiar warmth it installed, and pressed his fingers above the wound. The bright glow of green Kido rippled over Rose's torso as Shinji watched on with narrow eyes, and Mashiro stared wide-eyed. After a few moments, where Ichigo couldn't feel any ruptures in the blood vessels and the wound had sealed, Ichigo let the Kido fade. "Thank you very much, Ichigo," Rose said with a nod, something like surprise coloring his low baritone. Ichigo smiled, happy that he was able to heal the wizard, heal someone outside of training. It was a sign that Ichigo would be able to help his family if they were ever injured again. It was a sign he would be able to live up to his name. A ripple of Reiatsu rustled through the air, grabbing the small group's attention, and with a grin, Shinji announced, "Hachi's back." X. The banks were swollen with water, the tidal force of nature lapping at the shore with a voracious hunger as if it sought to flood Karakura. It wasn't like that night with the rain swelling it even further. But the rush of water was calming and draining in its own sort of way. Ichigo looked at his knuckles, saw the bruises and scrapes that covered his hands, some hidden by the bright plasters Yuzu had attacked him with. There had been a new transfer at school. He was tall and clearly a bit foreign. Ichigo had liked him immediately, but he had never been outgoing even before his mom's death. Ichigo had been walking home from school one day, contemplating what to help Yuzu prepare for dinner when he had heard it. Some of the local thugs had cornered the transfer student and were beating him. Ichigo hadn't paused, hadn't waited, just listened to instinct and the roaring agreement of Zangetsu. It had been worth it to see some light in the depths of those eyes, and to hand his coin back to him. It felt like a beginning. Ichigo wanted to protect his family and friends, and that meant being able to defend them. It also meant being the support they needed, being able to heal them when they got injured. Healing wasn't just physical. He wanted to do more, and Ichigo was beyond grateful that he had Kisuke and Tessai to teach him the art of Kido, but he knew there was more. It was like the Wizard, from the bare glimpses of what he had seen and had been able to comprehend. Ichigo knew that their souls weren't healthy, they were keeping half of their soul locked up. Ichigo couldn't imagine it. Though maybe it was something like losing his mom, that ache that was deeply set into your bones and exhausted you at every step. Ichigo was certain it was something like that. He wanted to help them heal. Shifting on the river bank, Ichigo thought about that night, a dull ache in his chest at the thought. He knew he hadn't killed his mom. That had been the hollow. All the same, Ichigo was the one who had tripped, and his mom had died protecting him. When Ichigo had mentioned the intense pressure he had felt for a few moments that night, Kisuke had quirked a brow and muttered about heritage into his cup of tea. It made Ichigo recall the funeral and what else had been there. There was some peace though in the fact that the hollow hadn't survived the encounter. Grand Fissure, a hollow that had preyed on numerous Shinigami. Kisuke hadn't revealed how his mother had defeated the creature, only nodded his head at Isshin in insinuation. Ichigo couldn't ask his father. The man was good with his sisters, but between the two of them, it felt like there was a chasm gaping its wide maw at Ichigo. The man was still his father, but conversations always felt like planets, only ever occasionally intercepting each other. A gust of wind caught at the river, sending a spray of cold mist into the air as it howled around Ichigo. Looking up from his knuckles, Ichigo felt the weight of Zangetsu's arms on his shoulders even as he noticed a new presence. It was something he had seen flickers of, a shadow and a glint of gold that was almost hollow-like, except the presence was far too different for that. There was a man standing at the edge of the river bank. He had a long furled cloak that swayed and moved in the breeze like it was floating. The spirit had curly hair, stubble, and a pair of translucent yellow glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. The spirit stared at Ichigo and he stared back. The silence between the two billowed with the wind as Ichigo identified the spirit was his. They always felt closer. After a minute, where the spirit's heavy and intense stare lingered, he started to move forward, gliding over the grass in what could only be described as a phantom-like motion. The spirit stopped a few feet in front of Ichigo and looked down at him, striking blue eyes narrowed in scrutiny. Zangetsu, curled around Ichigo, chuckled, the sound raspy and right near his ear, sending chills down his spine. I had hoped your powers would remain dormant, Ichigo. The spirit stated, his voice a deep baritone that rumbled like thunder. Ichigo blinked at the statement, feeling as if he was missing pieces of the story. The spirit's lips curved slightly into a smile as he kneeled in the grass in front of Ichigo. But I see now, that isn't possible. The spirit studied Ichigo for a moment, eyes inscrutable, before he continued in a quiet, somber tone. You are remarkably like your mother. Ichigo digested the statement with a small frown and a skip of his heart. Studying the spirit in front of him, he asked, what part of me do you represent? The spirit's gaze drifted away for a moment, studying the horizon in silence with a somber aura that spoke of grief. Ichigo wondered what his spirit saw, and he needed a name that provoked such emotions. A part of your heritage that you don't need to worry about now, Ichigo. The spirit, Osen, Ichigo decided, said, his gaze still centered on the horizon. Osen glanced once to Ichigo, his gaze absorbing the youth for a minute before the spirit shifted out of existence. Ichigo stared at the vacant space where the spirit had stood and wondered what the cryptic words meant. Sighing with a huff of laughter, Ichigo rose to his feet. He needed to return home soon, or else Yuzu and Karen would start to worry. In any case, Osen was part of Ichigo's soul as much as Zangetsu, and he had a feeling that if he really needed to know, the spirit would explain everything. Ichigo glanced at the river bank only once before he turned on the path towards the Kurosaki clinic. Shinji swirled the glass of sake in his hands and surveyed his comrades, Shinigami who he had become intimately familiar with over the years of their long exile. There were long shadows in the warehouse, the kind that no matter how many lights were scattered about, seemed only to grow. But that was okay. Rose liked to say it added atmosphere, and Love likened it to the mortal lounges Shinji had visited a few times. There was the background lilt of the latest pop band, bright and energetic because it was Lisa's turn to choose the music, and at their request had not chosen from her heavy metal selection. If the mortal world had any benefits, it was how advanced it was compared to Soul Society. Soul Society was like a hole in Shinji's chest, something that tugged at his heart and crumpled itself together at the back of his throat. He missed it, they all did. But the mortal world had its own benefits. Their technology was far ahead of anything Soul Society could dream of. Excluding the 12th, the various cultures of the world had drifted around Japan, leading to a variety of new inventions, both culinary and material. They were on their own now. Betrayal had set its mold and the die was cast. The only thing that had kept them going for so long, training, learning to live with each other, trying to accept the mortal world, had been the thought of revenge. Ichigo had been part of that revenge, the potential alone enough to give them hope, but those plans had and were changing. Shinji couldn't say he faulted Kisuke. The mortal world had also led to the visit meeting Ichigo. The kid was like a walking miracle, in more ways than one. He was powerful, charismatic, intelligent, and a whole other slew of things that boiled down to one interesting kid. Shinji knew when Ichigo had first walked into the warehouse that he had seen the other spirits. Maybe the kid had adopted Kisuke's mannerisms, but some part of Shinji also knew that the kid wasn't scared. They were all still cautious around him. He was small, he hardly reached Shinji's elbow, and he was human. Ichigo didn't have the durability of a Shinigami, nor did he have the years upon years they all did. But when Ichigo had visited for the second time today, he had thrown himself into the spars with a technique that practically screamed prodigy of some kind. The spars had all been light, no shikai, just a test of the kid's skill. Kisuke may have wanted the kid to get experience in fighting people who were more powerful, who had different shikai, or whatever. But they wanted to know the kid first, see what he could handle. Kisuke, the mother hen, probably knew that and had only stayed away because of Hiyuri's rather boisterous personality. Shinji didn't blame the former captain of the 12th Division. Ichigo had surprised them all with the spar. He hadn't beaten them, that would be ridiculous and pitiful. But he definitely could hold his own for more than 10 minutes against most of them. They had decided to wait on unleashing Hiyuri on him. Afterwards, the kid had been content to sit in the living room and talk to everyone about their life story, what Rangakai was like, what division they had been in. If the kid hadn't been so endearingly honest and curious, Shinji would have placed the kid for a plant or a spy of some device by Aizen. But no, that was just Ichigo. Glancing at the others, Shinji watched them for a moment. Love and Rose were squished together on one of the settees looking at someone's musical composition. Lisa was in the ugly green armchair, a stack of manga at her side along with a notebook and pen. Kenshi was sitting on the couch watching the TV as a sport of some kind flashed across it. Mashiro was at his feet letting Kenshi weave clumsy braids into the verdant strands. Hachi was in the kitchen humming as he prepared what could be dinner or a round of drinks. And Hiyuri? Shinji wasn't necessarily sure, but he had seen her sulk off into the rafters about an hour ago. What do y'all think of Ichigo? The question rippled through the silence of the room like a pebble dropped into still waters. Lisa's eyes flickered from her book. Love and Rose glanced up, and Mashiro tilted her head. Love shook his head with a grin, trading a glance with Rose, and answered, "He's interesting, got spunk. I think it is quite interesting that he can see spirits. He showed little reaction to our spirits when we were introduced to him." Rose added as Hachi peeked his head through the doorway. Lisa huffed and adjusted the glasses perched on the bridge of her nose and added, "He definitely saw them though. I doubt he recognized them for what they are. He has a lot of Reiatsu. It's dangerous for a kid to have that much." Kenshi added with a grunt as his fingers resumed their braiding. Shinji nodded, rubbing a finger over the glass. He added, "That's why Kisuke is training the kid. It's partially why his mom died." Hachi brought out a tray of drinks, steam curling in gentle wisps, and added, "His heritage is that of Shinigami and Quincy, with hollow thrown in as well, correct?" Shinji nodded and traded his sake for a mug of tea. Rose twisted in his seat and said, "His lack of reaction was interesting. Ichigo is what, 8, 9? He didn't recoil, didn't scream, didn't even go pale. Our spirits aren't the same as the others. The words twisted onto the air, filling their thoughts. Shinji wondered what the kid had seen, what Ichigo could see if he continued to train with them. Wondered if the kid even knew that their spirits were hollow, not just strange or dark. They had control over their hollow side, but accidents could always occur. Shinji wondered why they didn't scare the kid. Beritan has a lot of power, so we'll get to see his reaction when we use our masks. Mashiro added as she sipped at the hot chocolate Hachi had prepared for her. Kenshi scoffed at the statement and ground his hand against Mashiro's hair even as Lisa set her book down and questioned, should we even be interacting with him? We could awaken his own hollow nature. The kid could end up hating us. Thank you for the ever-nihilistic commentary, Shinji replied even as the heavy atmosphere settled like lead in their bones at the statement. They were taking a risk with the kid, maybe he would end up hating them, maybe he would grow to fear their Zanpakuto spirits. Shinji didn't know if he would be able to handle the kid looking at them like that, with fear in his eyes, or to see the kid with golden eyes lost in his own mind. If we awaken the midget's hollow nature, we'll just train him, idiots. Hiyuri snapped where she appeared from the hallway, a scowl on her features as she settled onto one of the chairs and picked up Shinji's discarded sake. Shinji shook his head with a snort at Hiyuri's answer. Regardless, Ichigo asked to train with us, it is a chance for us to learn more about our own spirits. Rose added as his long spindly fingers coiled around a mismatched mug. Love squished beside the thin blonde nodded his agreement and added, Ichigo will awaken his hollow nature eventually. He's already one of us. Love didn't mean having a hollow side. They all cared for Ichigo, sure it was only the second time most of them had met the kid, but Ichigo was honest in a way things hadn't been for years. He cared, looked at them as if they were more than what they had been forced into. Shinji had no doubt they would only come to care more for the kid over time. We will see with time, Hachi added, summing up the wizard's thoughts before he added, now come drink, tea is best drunk hot. Ichigo entered the industrial district alone. This in of itself wasn't necessarily an unusual fact as this had happened more than a few times. What was unusual was that one of the wizard was not a step behind Ichigo, nor hiding obtrusively, or parking a vehicle of some kind in a hidden garage. Usually, if Ichigo was heading to the warehouse immediately after school, which occurred weekly, one of the wizard would accompany him. But something had come up, some issue that they felt he didn't need to worry about. Kisuke had offered to walk Ichigo, if only for his own peace of mind, and even Isshin had offered to drop Ichigo off at his training. He had denied the offers, it wasn't too far a walk from the school if he rode the regional bus, and besides Ichigo wasn't helpless and he wasn't defenseless, he had already established his rule over the local Yakuza. It wasn't cockiness, Ichigo knew that Zangetsu wouldn't let anything happen, and Ichigo knew his own strength. When you sparred against Shinigami who had trained for centuries and could beat you in a minute, it was easy to feel humble. The broad light of the early afternoon slanted and wavered over the collection of warehouses near the wizard's base, catching and dragging out the shadows hiding in the dark. Ichigo's hand tightened imperceptibly on the strap of his backpack as his eyes darted around, his Reiatsu reaching around him to sense anything irregular. A few of the more daring idiots had tried to harass Ichigo outside of the district, but there was nothing now, just the cool whistle of wind through the paneling all around him. It was subtle, a barely noticeable distortion of air that could have been mistaken for summer heat if it wasn't the middle of fall. Ichigo's eyes narrowed at the sight and he could feel Zangetsu shift to attention, the intangible weight of the spirit suddenly behind him, the flicker of cloth, a stormy Mioff white and black appearing in the corner of his vision. Allowing his Reiatsu to pool around him like Kisuke had shown him, and decided was the best method, Ichigo stepped cautiously forward. If it was a Kido barrier, it would react when he reached a certain distance. It could be one of Hachi's for proximity or any other manner of things. Or it could be one of Soul Society's. Ichigo didn't know why the wizard were in Karakura, only that they weren't exactly friendly with Soul Society, and that would be warning enough. It could also be a hollow, Ichigo acknowledged as his hand tightened into a fist. Sometimes they had weird quirks beyond size or appendages. There was a spike of Reiatsu, noticeable as it rose amongst the sea of his own Reiatsu, and a snap of instincts that bristled behind his spine. Ichigo darted to the side in a whirl of Shuunpa and turned his attention on his surroundings. There was nothing visible, only deep gouges in the pavement where he had once been standing and a shimmer of heat waves all around him. Tensing slightly, Ichigo forced himself to relax and materialized his Zanpakuto. Ichigo listened to his instincts as they guided him into a roll and to his feet before spinning out with a slash of Zangetsu. Crimson painted the air in an arc as if appearing from nowhere, accompanied by the grating roar of a hollow. But still, nothing was visible. Peering out of the corner of his eye at Zangetsu, Ichigo questioned, "Can you see it?" The spirit shook his head and one hand tugged Ichigo out of the way of a claw. The invisible weapon passing clean through Zangetsu was a somewhat disconcerting image. Ichigo frowned and closed his eyes. If he couldn't see the hollow, then he would have to hear it. Ichigo never thought he would be thankful for the multitude of times Kisuke had blindfolded him in their spars. Ichigo inhaled and exhaled, listening to his surroundings, to the heavy footsteps of the hollow, its harsh breathing, the grind of something, likely a tail, against the pavement, and moved. Zangetsu flashed through the air as Ichigo moved forward in a quick shurumpa, only for the hollow to disappear. Rolling to his feet, Ichigo frowned. Hollows didn't just teleport, or at least most of them didn't do that, and be invisible. The more powerful ones, called Espada Could, Kisuke called it Sonido. But they were all in Hueco Mundo. With a flash of warning, Ichigo ducked out of the way and spun around Zangetsu, catching once more on the hollow. It was only a shallow wound. Feeling a slight panic start to rise at the back of his throat at the thought of fighting this hollow who was different from the ones he had encountered on patrol, Ichigo took a deep breath and focused on his Reiatsu and what Zangetsu was telling him. Ichigo's spirit wasn't like Benihime, and not just because all spirits were different. Zangetsu was something else, more instinct than logic at times. He knew what it was already, had seen it in Zangetsu's appearance and what they had discovered when they were training on their own. But Ichigo didn't understand it and was content to wait for Kisuke to explain when the man decided it was time. Listening to the snap of Reiatsu, Ichigo rolled under an overhead strike and began to recite the chant for Aikido in his mind. If Ichigo had the right opportunity, he could attempt to blast the hollow with a full-powered shaka. Perhaps that would stop whatever was keeping the creature from being seen. Pressing one hand to his side as Ichigo gathered his Reiatsu, he focused on what Tessai always said during their impromptu despair-filled Kido lessons. Tessai would grin, ruffle Ichigo's hair, and say, "Just focus on one layer at a time. Like architecture, each verse is one floor." So, Ichigo did that as he sprinted to the other side of the clearing and hid for a moment in the shade of a warehouse, attempting to catch his breath. The wind whistled, and the air hummed as Ichigo jumped over a low sweeping attack and let Zangetsu WHP out with his unoccupied hand. The blade didn't connect. Ichigo could feel that as he whirled away, drawing closer to the last verse. The feel of the Kido was around his hand, hot and burning from the tips of his fingers to his heart. Ichigo waited till he felt the torrent of air pass over his face as he ducked to release the Kido. The shaka burst from his hand in a spark of crimson and collided with the invisible hollow in a flash that forced the creature back with a howl. Ichigo stood for a moment and stared, something inside of him cheering viciously that he had managed to cast the Kido even as his body tensed and he ducked. It was a moment too late, and Ichigo coughed out half of his lung as he collided with one of the warehouse's walls. In a single moment, the air was driven from his lungs and Zangetsu clattered to the ground beside him. Ichigo blinked his eyes open and stared at the blurry image of the world in front of him, even as his instincts were screaming at him to get up, move, or he would die. Then who would he be able to protect? "Ichigo!" A voice called as clumsy fingers grasped weakly at Zangetsu's hilt. Ichigo glanced up and blinked. Mashiro was running towards him, none of a normal bounce in her step. She was sprinting as if she could see the hollow in front of him. She was wearing her mask, the one that they rarely wore, in front of him. Ichigo glanced up, time seeming like molasses in his hands as the air shimmered in front of him and his instincts told like the bells of a city spelling out danger. Suddenly, Mashiro was in front of Ichigo, a burst of Reiatsu that was distinctively not Shinigami accompanying the humming motion as a torrent of Reiatsu surged from her outstretched palm and sliced through the air, and presumably the hollow. It clicked and Ichigo stared up at the green-haired wizard with wide eyes as the invisible hollow crumpled to dust. Mashiro turned, concern written on her features as she crouched in front of him, one hand reaching to close over his own as she smiled at him. It wasn't the normal wide and energetic smile, it was tender. "Are you okay, Ichigo?" Mashiro questioned softly as Ichigo stared at her, the adrenaline from the fight beginning to fade. It left Ichigo with the overwhelming realization of his survival and what the Vizard actually were. He managed a rough nod eventually. It was obvious in hindsight, and maybe Ichigo had always known. Their masks, their spirits' gold eyes, the darkest part of them, all of it seemed glaringly obvious. Though in Ichigo's defense there was no information about how it was even possible, and they surely didn't talk about it. Not to mention, while their spirits were different from Benihime, Zangetsu was different from them. Ichigo just wanted an explanation. A hand appeared in front of Ichigo's eyes, and he glanced up at Mashiro, who was staring at him with furrowed brows and a pout. The energetic woman gently grasped Ichigo's shoulders and with one movement tugged him to his feet. It was easy to forget how strong Mashiro was, Zangetsu's blade dematerializing and fading away as Ichigo let his Reiatsu settle. He could feel his spirit hovering behind him, warm and like an embrace, as Mashiro checked him over for injuries. As if on autopilot, Ichigo did the same first, for Mashiro and then himself. Mashiro was unharmed, but Ichigo had some bruising on the back of his skull and a few shallow abrasions from the pavement, though thankfully there was no sign of a concussion. "Let's go back, okay, Ichi?" "Everyone's waiting," Mashiro stated and started to walk SWNGNG, Ichigo's hand in hers as she continued to fill the silence. Everyone was starting to get worried when you didn't arrive at the usual time. Shinji started pacing, and that's a sign that he was really worried. And then the proximity wards Hachi set up tripped and we were all super worried. Shinji wanted to come himself, but then Hiyuri, well, he was needed along with everyone else. "But they had it handled well enough, so I came." Ichigo processed the jumble of words as he held Mashiro's hand, taking a fraction of comfort in the warmth of her fingers. He wondered now, as he recalled their spirits, how he had noticed they were unhealthy. He wondered, and it festered in his mind like the logic problems Benihime gave him. As soon as Ichigo entered the warehouse, he was swamped on all sides by most of the Vizard. Hachi was in the forefront, looking both Mashiro and Ichigo over while Shinji hovered over the man's shoulder. Love and Rose were staring in concern on his left, and Lisa was on his right, studying him with those intense eyes of hers. Their spirits weren't visible yet, all the same, the air felt supercharged. "What happened?" Shinji demanded as he bundled Ichigo over to the couch, and Mashiro spoke to Kenshi alone for a moment, their foreheads touching, and hands clasped. Ichigo squished his face up and shrugged, which earned a glare from Shinji accompanied by a raised brow. There was a hollow, but it was invisible, Ichigo stated, and Shinji nodded, likely gathering there was more to the story, if only from Ichigo's still somewhat shocked expression. Ichigo continued, "But the hollow could teleport. I landed a few hits on it, but sometimes it wasn't even where it was supposed to be. Oh. I used chakra on it, and it worked." Shinji smiled at the news, but nodded again, features grim. Ichigo took a breath and frowned, suddenly losing the energy his earlier success had provided him with. The youth continued, "The hollow surprised me, and I hit a wall, no concussion, but I was dazed and couldn't get up. Then Mashiro appeared and she used an energy-based attack to purify the hollow." Shinji's gaze widened at Ichigo's statement, and he could feel the attention of the others at his words. The leader of the Vizard surveyed Ichigo once as if to verify his words before his gaze flickered to Mashiro and his eyes narrowed. Ichigo felt the tension in the room skyrocket, like a visible fog settling around him as the others stared at Ichigo with varying expressions he couldn't see but felt where he was squished into the couch cushion. Zangetsu appeared beside Ichigo and wrapped his arms around him as a silence descended, a sort of awkward one that was trying to be dramatic as the Vizard stared at each other. Ichigo took the opportunity offered to him and tried to analyze how he felt about the revelation. His mom had been killed by a hollow. The Vizard were something between Shinigami and hollow. Ichigo wasn't sure if he was supposed to feel bitter. He didn't hate hollows, did he hate Grand Fisher? Yes. But all hollows? No, how could he? They were souls who had been unable to pass on, and their soul chain had devoured them. It wasn't their fault, in fact, it was the Shinigami's lack of presence in the human world that likely contributed to the growing hollow population, at least that was what Benihime reasoned. But regardless of facts Kisuke had delivered the first night Ichigo had been introduced to Reiatsu, he didn't hate hollows. Did he feel bitter about the Vizard not telling him? Ichigo wondered for a moment before acknowledging that while they had never confirmed it, they had been plain enough. Ichigo supposed in the end that what bothered him most, as always, drew back to their spirits, to how unhealthy their souls were. He was a protector, a healer. The Vizard were family and they were suffering. A pale yellow mug appeared in front of Ichigo's eyes, and he glanced up to see Hachi holding the mug. There was something infinitely warm in the man's eyes, and Ichigo grinned in thanks as he accepted the hot chocolate. Sipping quietly on the warm drink as it seeped its way through the dull layer of shock, Ichigo watched as Shinji and the others spoke in a quiet circle, occasionally glancing at him. The doors to the warehouse slid open with a creak that practically demanded someone oil the hinges. Kisuke stood in the entryway with Yoruichi behind him. The scientist's hat was tipped low over his eyes as he surveyed the room, and Yoruichi stood poised with lethal grace. It was all very dramatic and intimidating. When Kisuke's eyes landed on Ichigo, the man's shoulders untensed and the man strode forward, ignoring the Vizard.
Are you okay, Ichigo?
Kisuke questioned, one hand reaching out to ruffle his hair as he crouched in front of Ichigo. Sipping at his hot chocolate, Ichigo nodded, and after peering around for eavesdroppers he asked, "Are they going to continue talking all night or give an explanation?" The man in front of him chuckled, the sound familiar and comforting as it was accompanied by a flash of teeth that formed a grin. Kisuke nodded, something flashing in his eyes, as he asked, "Explain what? How or why part of their souls is hollow?" Ichigo responded, deciding to play the game with Kisuke. Benihime, standing ethereally behind her owner, the long fall of black hair shining in the light, winked once at Ichigo before fading away. Kisuke blinked at the question, tilted his head, bit his lip, furrowed his brow, and finally responded, that. Yes, that. Mashiro clearly used hollow-based techniques when she defended me. I think that she used Sonodo and Sero, but I'm not certain. Ichigo replied and took a sip of his hot chocolate, peering at his uncle over the lip of the yellow mug. Kisuke scratched a hand through his hair, ignoring his hat, and stared at Ichigo before he shook his head and replied, "You are too smart for your own good, Ichigo. But yes, we'll explain everything." In a whisper to himself he added, "It's necessary if you were targeted." Then Kisuke stood up, ruffled Ichigo's hair, and drifted over to speak to Shinji and the group huddler Vizard. Ichigo debated the merit of waiting for them to finish the exclusive discussion over barging in and demanding an answer right away. But the couch was comfy, and he was warm, so Ichigo decided he could wait for 10 minutes and no more. Eventually, they all moved over to the seating area, settling and squishing into place with their collective attention focused on Ichigo. A silence descended, thick and awkward, as if no one could decide who should start first and what to say. "We weren't born like this," Love stated, and Ichigo could feel his gaze from behind the shade of his glasses. The man frowned and continued, "This was forced upon us." Ichigo frowned at the knowledge and wondered how it was possible to change a soul like that. Kisuke tipped his hat over his eyes, shading his face in shadows. He added, "You know that everyone here once held a position in Soul Society, Ichigo. There was, or rather is, a traitor among the Shinigami, Aizen. Susuke. He is a genius, a megalomaniac, and incredibly powerful. He's also a right foo-fricking bstrd. He's the one who did this to us, has killed and made experiments of others too." Shinji added with a vitriol in his voice Ichigo hadn't heard before. This person, Aizen, he sounded dangerous beyond even the might of Soul Society if his mechanization extended as far back as they appeared. Ichigo nodded, pushing aside the thoughts for later contemplation. He questioned, "So how does it work with you guys?" Something seemed to settle in the air at the question, something that had been tense, like someone waiting on the edge of a seat. Shinji and Kisuke traded a meaning-filled glance even as Lisa stated, "Our Zanpakuto spirits were hollowified. They became uncontrollable, able to take over our bodies. We became locked in a fight for Demonitise. It is through Kisuke's intervention that we were given the time to learn how to suppress our spirits. We are able to draw on that power and use the masks you've seen along with other technique." The answer was clinical, technical, like something read from a textbook. Lisa, for all the cold exterior, didn't speak like that normally. There was something apathetic to her gaze, like if she spoke about it any other way it would be too real. Ichigo didn't like what he was hearing. Suppressing their Zanpakuto spirit? How could one cut out half their soul, bar the door on communication, and not go crazy? If Ichigo had learned anything through Zangetsu and Benihime, it was that your soul, your Zanpakuto, no matter how it reflected it, was a part of you, it was you in a sense. Zangetsu shifted at Ichigo's back and Ichigo knew his spirit felt the same. Suddenly, Ichigo couldn't accept that, leaving his family to be cut off from half their soul, their drive for revenge clear now that Ichigo understood the purpose. Ichigo glanced up from the mug in his hands, noticed the anxious glances and stated, "I think you're going about it all wrong. Zangetsu is like your spirits and we get along perfectly well. Your spirits are all trapped, immobilized, or hardly cognizant. That's not right." They stared at Ichigo, really stared at him in a drowning silence that he was beginning to tire of. After a moment, Shinji tipped his head back and began laughing. The sound was light at first glance, but there was something else beneath it all, something like a sob. Love shook his head and stared at Ichigo. Mashiro was grinning as if she had been right all along, and Rose was staring at his hands with something like guilt in his eyes. Hachi was studying Ichigo with something like awe, and Kisuke and Yoruichi were staring at him with wide eyes. "Only you, Ichigo," Shinji announced as he regained his breath, shaking his head and staring at the kid curled up on the couch. The kid who was smarter than them all, probably, the kid whose answer was so simple in words yet complicated beyond measure, in reality, the kid with a spirit like theirs, and he knew it, and they all wondered now what the kid thought of them, of their spirits. Kenshi stood drawing the attention of the group. He walked over to Ichigo and kneeled down, so they could look each other in the eyes. The wizard, who held a stoic exterior like a coat of armor but was a softy on the inside, reached out and ruffled Ichigo's hair before asking, "Do you think you could help us with things then, Ichigo?" The wizard stared at Ichigo. He could see Kisuke and Yoruichi studying him, could almost feel the pause in the air. He could almost see the faint shadows of their spirits. They were his family as much as Yuzu and Karen. They were training him, and he would return the favor. Ichigo nodded with a bright smile. X. Aizen stared at the monitor in front of him with a frown. Kaname stood behind him with something pleased to his Reiatsu. The Shinigami thought he had been the first to notice the irregularity in the video footage. Sasuke had noticed it over a year before but had chosen to wait and see how the situation developed. Ichigo Kurosaki, the outcome of his experimental hollow, Isshin Shiba, and Mosoki Kurosaki. The child had potential for his bloodline alone. He would grow to challenge Aizen in power and likely ability, something worth noting in the isolation his powers imposed. But the child was growing beyond his expectations and the plans outlined. The pawns were moving on their own accord. Aizen wasn't certain if the fact was irritating or intriguing for the potential it provided. Mosoki Kurosaki had died as planned, but Kisuke, the thrice-damned meddler, had taken a material position in Ichigo's life. Aizen understood how the scientist's mind worked, had known he would prefer to remain unattached to Ichigo while his plans bore fruition. But Kisuke had interfered, had gotten close to the child and was training him in the Shinigami arts. It was also likely, from the footage the insects had gathered of the child walking towards the industrial district, where footage shorted out due to the Kido barriers, that he was training with the wizard. There was also the footage Kaname was so proud of finding. Aizen had noticed the child speaking to the air, speaking to nothing even when the insects were able to observe the spiritual plane within the mortal world. At first, Aizen had estimated it was an imaginary friend. They were common for young children, even those who saw spirits. But then, Ichigo had materialized a sealed Zanpakuto and its name when he fought against a hollow. Aizen was certain now that the child was, in fact, seeing Zanpakuto spirits. There were little other reasonable deductions. The prospect was interesting, and it left Sasuke to wonder how the child's growth would be affected. Staring at the screen, Aizen watched as Ichigo Kurosaki spoke to thin air and planned. X. Ichigo tucked the groceries in his hands under one arm as he opened the door. He ducked automatically under his father's outstretched foot, letting the overgrown man-child fly out onto the street. Closing the door behind him, Ichigo shook his head and entered their home. It was different to how it had been when his mom had been alive. There had been more of a feminine touch, something a bit warmer too. But it was still their home regardless. Yuzu and Karen were seated at the dining room table, an empty plate and 2 mugs between the two, along with everything one could need to complete homework, which was to say a mountain of paper. Karen was slumped forward, her head planted on the table as if that would allow her to absorb the information on the sheets. Yuzu was dutifully filling it out with a determined look she had taken straight from Ichigo. It was math homework, he decided. Nothing else could put an expression like that on a 7-year-old's face. Yuzu was the first to notice Ichigo as he shuffled towards the kitchen, keeping a wary eye on the floor to see if their father had attempted to cook. Again. Their dad was good at making 3 recipes, and that was his repertoire. Anything else tended to blow up, like Ichigo's attempts at Kido. "Ichini!" Yuzu chirped, slipping from the table to run over and wrap her skinny arms around him. Ichigo grinned at his younger sister but couldn't ruffle her hair like he wanted to due to his occupied hands. Pulling back, Yuzu noticed the groceries in his hands and her eyes brightened. She had given him strict instructions that morning to buy ingredients for both onigiri and mochi so that Yuzu could try their mom's recipe. "Hi, Ichigo." Karen greeted with a wave where she had lifted her head up from the table. Ichigo grinned at Karen and replied, "I'll come to help you with your homework. Let me just get dinner started, okay?" The dark-haired twin brightened at his words and nodded with a wide grin that was far more predatory than it needed to be. Maybe having Tatsuki tutor Karen in martial arts, particularly judo, wasn't the best idea. At least Yuzu had chosen Taikai. Ichigo looked down when he felt a tug on his shirt and followed Yuzu into the kitchen. "How was training today?" Yuzu asked as together they worked to put the small bag of groceries away, pulling out the stool to reach the higher shelves, and debating whether to put the rice on the lower shelf for the future or to follow tradition. Nodding as Ichigo pulled out the rice cooker and put a pot of water on the stove, he responded, "It was good. Kisuke showed me a new move to use when one of the local Yakuza tried to use a knife on me." Karen's head peeked over the window at that statement with keen intrigue. Ichigo could tell his sister would become a vicious power on the streets in her own right. Yuzu didn't gasp. She had long demanded the truth and gotten used to it. Instead, she replied, "Just be careful, Ichini." "Always," Ichigo responded honestly as he chopped the pork before. With a tilt of his head he asked the twins, "How was school?" Karen groaned at the question as if the mere thought of school was torture, while Yuzu shrugged as she passed Ichigo the chopped vegetables. Ichigo took the plate and added it to the pot, checking on the rice. Suddenly, Yuzu brightened as if remembering something and added, "On the way home from school Karen saw a ghost." "Really? Where?" Ichigo asked curiously, part of him screaming in warning to Konsu the soul as soon as possible so it wouldn't attract hollows, a redundant point considering his Reiatsu. Karen and Yuzu shared a glance that he pretended not to notice, as any brother should when it came to twins, and returned his attention to the simmering pot. "Near the school," Yuzu replied as she hopped up onto the stool beside Ichigo to peer at the pot. Ichigo handed the spoon to her and guided her arm in the correct movement like his mom had shown him. Smiling at the twins, he suggested, "How about we walk home from school together tomorrow and you can show me where?" Karen made a face at Ichigo, but Yuzu nodded in that endearing way of hers that made Ichigo recall tiny little hands grasping his own. Nodding to himself, Ichigo studied the pot and decided that the kitchen would survive if he sat at the dining table and helped the twins with their homework. With a mischievous grin, Ichigo attacked and picked Yuzu up, tucking her over his shoulder and accompanying the motion with an evil laugh. Yuzu's fists battered weakly against his shoulder as Ichigo marched over to the table, struggling only a tiny bit with her weight as Karen followed behind and demanded he put her down. With a chuckle, Ichigo plopped Yuzu on her seat at the table. She giggled even as Karen with a huff slunk to her seat. It made Ichigo happy to see his sisters like this. After their mom had died, it had felt like the life had been sucked out of their home, like everyone had just been going through the motion. That had changed now. Yuzu smiled, and though Karen had adopted a tough exterior, she was just as happy as Yuzu. "Now why don't you show me what's giving you trouble?" Ichigo stated as he slid into a chair beside his sisters, peering at the sheets of paper with his own curling sense of dread. Ichigo was smart, Benihime would accept nothing less, but regardless, homework was homework and he still had his own to do. Together they went over the equations. Ichigo explained it patiently and tried to teach it to the twins in a way that they might understand better than the teacher's explanation. "Ichigo?" Karen questioned as the twins worked on the problems on their own, and Ichigo took a moment to breathe, feeling Zangetsu's presence around him as the spirit rested his elbows on Ichigo's shoulders, an intangible weight. Ichigo nodded and Karen's eyes flickered up, as if to Zangetsu before she added, "Lately, I've been seeing some things that aren't spirits." "Yuzu's seen it occasionally too." Ichigo paused at the information, surprise making its way across his features for a moment. Dumbly he responded, "Oh." Yuzu and Karen traded another glance and Ichigo shook himself from the shock, and with a nod at Zangetsu Ichigo turned to the twins and with seriousness pulling at his features he explained, "I think what you are seeing is the same as what I'm seeing. You know how Shinigami have Zanpakuto spirits?" Ichigo questioned, and when the girls nodded he continued, "Well, what you're seeing is my Zanpakuto spirit, I think. His name is Zangetsu. You might also be seeing Uncle Kisuke's spirit, her name is Beniheim. They can't touch you, but they can talk to you. But you can't tell anyone, okay? You know your spirit, Ichigo?" Karen questioned, something pensive in her eyes as she stared at the space behind Ichigo. Yuzu was also staring with a light frown curling her lips as Ichigo nodded once. At that moment, the door to their home slammed open and their dad appeared. He took one look at the three of them together at the dinner table and began to wail to the poster of Mom about family values. Ichigo rolled his eyes and entered the kitchen to escape his father, but first, he flashed a wink at the twins. As he checked on the food, Ichigo could hear Karen attempt to berate their father for sobbing at the portrait of their mom, even as Yuzu tried to make peace of their situation. They were his family and he would protect them no matter what.